welcome to the Krusty Fox and, Sex in the City. No, hear me out. I love this show. Not because it's good, because spoiler alert, it isn't. Or because of the dodgy 90s and early noughties fashion. Not even for the highly questionable, even for the time, relationship advice. I enjoy it because near enough all of the characters are competing with each other to be the worst person alive. And just when you thought they'd achieved peak train wreck, they find a way to outdo themselves. So join me in exploring the story of a group of friends who are continually surprised that self-interest, vindictiveness, and occasionally outright insanity don't make for a happy ever after. The first ever episode begins with one of the many self-indulgent voiceovers we'll get from our problematic heroine, Carrie Bradshaw. Carrie is a sex columnist for the New York Star, but don't worry about retaining that piece of information because she rarely remembers it herself. Carrie tells us the story of Elizabeth, a writer who moves to New York and meets Tim, a wealthy, popular investment banker. We're told that Tim is one of NYC's many eligible bachelors, but in what becomes a recurring theme throughout the series, he's actually just a plain man in a beige suit with a haircut which suggests that he's at least mildly sexist. English Rose Elizabeth, who is clearly and unrepentantly Australian, embarks on a 2-week yuppie love affair with Tim. Their whirlwind romance is swiftly torpedoed when Tim cancels a planned dinner with Elizabeth and his parents while wearing the kind of suspenders that scream "my success is mostly performative." Elizabeth conveniently overlooks the fact that they've only known each other for a fortnight and promptly goes insane when Tim fails to reschedule their dinner or return her calls. She relays this story to a chain-smoking Carrie, who laments the supposed end of love in Manhattan, in blissful ignorance of the decade she's about to spend trying to force a succession of men into it whether they like it or not. As if by way of a mission statement, Carrie asks the audience why there are so many great unmarried women but so few great unmarried men. This question goes unanswered for the rest of the series because Carrie fails to pick up on the show's overarching message. Every man and woman is awful in their own unique and horrifying way. We're treated to a bunch of talking head clips, which along with Carrie breaking the fourth wall are mercifully phased out by the end of season 2. Possibly due to them all being the same, in the sense that the men spout hot toxic garbage and the women blame them for the failure of every relationship in the history of the universe. During the course of this, we're introduced to Carrie's friends. Miranda Hobbes, a terminally judgmental corporate lawyer who nobody would be friends with in real life, and Charlotte York, an art dealer who thinks and acts like a warped Jane Austen character. We also meet Skipper Johnston, a friend of Carrie's who, in a sign of the times, is labelled as a website creator. Skipper is also given the dubious title of hopeless romantic, though he eventually reveals himself to be a late 90s prototype for a nice guy neckbeard. You know the type, the ones who think that they deserve intercourse because they opened the door for their date and remembered not to call her a whore. Not to be left out, Miranda echoes a line from one of the toxic Vox Pops when she claims to have dated some short, fat and poor men and found them to be just as self-centered and unappreciative as the good-looking ones. Stay classy, Miranda. We catch up with the three friends at Miranda's birthday meal, which is inexplicably held at what looks like a roadside cafe with drag queen waitresses. Here we also meet the last group member, Samantha Jones. Samantha is a PR executive and sexually liberated commitment phobe. She's routinely positioned as a bit of a lost cause, but ultimately ends up being the only one of them with an ounce of common sense. Here lies the hook of this episode, as the ladies discuss the shifting power balance between men and women in the city. Women, they say, are finally achieving and earning as much as the local men are. Apparently this troubles the menfolk of NYC as they worry that women might turn the tables and begin treating them as sexual objects. Carrie, never one to miss an opportunity to be contrary, asks where romance is in all of this. Miranda recalls the time she dated a poet, which is frankly her own fault. Charlotte, meanwhile, is scandalized at the idea of her friends giving up on love. This proves to be the first of many signs that she thinks of herself as a Disney princess fighting to stay afloat in a veritable sea of sluts. We're then treated to one of the show's most frequent tropes, that of the ladies stuffing themselves with delicious food but somehow remaining a size 2. In this case, Carrie sits in bed with her laptop, shotgunning a tub of Ben & Jerry's. I can only assume that she's been sniffing each spoonful before flinging them out of a nearby open window into the street. Carrie then has dinner with old friend Stanford Blatch, a washed-up talent agent and one of only a handful of gay characters in the show's entire run who are allowed to speak. Surprisingly for an HBO show created and often written by gay men, Stanford is a lecherous one-note stereotype who looks and dresses like a Christmas elf in the off-season. Carrie spots an old flame called Kurt at the restaurant's bar, who she declares to be a self-centered creep. Presumably keen to meet him at his level, Carrie decides to experiment on him for her column, by using him as a sexual object. She wastes no time in obtaining an invitation to his apartment that afternoon, a goal she achieves with the kind of cigarette-sharing flirtation usually seen in the alleys behind dive bars. She has an apparently satisfactory off-screen tumble with him, complete with some unconvincing sound effects, and then leaves before he can get any satisfaction of his own. This, we're led to believe, is a stunning win for feminism and definitely not an unnecessary mind game being played by a narcissist. Although, in fairness, Kurt does use the word alrighty when they're in bed together, and so I'm not really sure whose side I'm on anymore. Outside of Kurt's apartment, Carrie's purse is knocked out of her hands and its contents spill onto the pavement. A supposedly handsome stranger with another sexist haircut and slug-like eyebrows that betray the just for men he's been using for a decade comes to her aid. Skipper later meets Carrie for coffee and confesses that he hasn't been intimate with a woman for a year. Carrie expresses surprise, since he's such a nice guy, fueling an inadequacy complex which I'm sure by now Skipper would have parlayed into a moderator role on an incel subreddit. When Skipper declares that he just has too many feelings, Carrie bluntly and problematically asks if he's sure that he isn't gay. Because, as any psychology textbook will tell you, only gay men have emotions. Carrie sets Skipper up on a date with Miranda, who she believes will hate him. Her supposed kindness could only come from her also hating Skipper and harbouring a desire to witness his slow torture over the course of an entire evening. Later, Charlotte calls Carrie to let her know that she has a date with Capote Duncan, a publishing big shot, allegedly unobtainable bachelor and possessor of the world's most pretentious name. Charlotte intends not to treat Capote like an object, I assume because there's only room for one in a relationship and she's already accepted the job. At a club appropriately named Chaos, Miranda turns up for her date with Skipper, suitably dressed like a pallbearer. Skipper himself sits slack-jawed at the bar, which seems to be his interpretation of a less sensitive man. As predicted, Miranda wastes no time in identifying reasons to hate the ground he walks on, a situation Skipper then tries to remedy with some uninvited touching. Elsewhere in the club, Carrie runs into Kurt again. He turns the tables on her by actually being into her objectification of him. This disproves Carrie's theory, and because yet another man has managed to escape before she's sucked his soul out through his face, leaves her crestfallen. Samantha points out a man she's into across the room, who turns out to be the stranger who helped Carrie earlier. Unfortunately, she introduces him as the next Donald Trump, an honour that has aged about as well as porn star urine on hotel sheets. Carrie describes Samantha's self-confidence as deluded. This slur doesn't age especially well as the series progresses, since Carrie's own belief in herself is about on the level of someone in a full body cast competing in the Olympic high jump. Charlotte, keen to keep Capote on the hook, agrees to go back to his apartment with him. She manages to maintain her composure even though it's decorated like his interior designer closed their eyes, held out their arms and spun around in the IKEA discount warehouse. Keen not to give away too much on the first date, because her brain has seemingly time-travelled to 1847, Charlotte casts around for a reason to leave. She ends up deploying the only excuse for ending a date any of the core group ever seem to have, namely that she has to get up early the next morning. Downstairs, she climbs into a cab, but Capote jumps in next to her. He heads for Chaos, since if Charlotte isn't going to stay over, then he'll find someone else who will. The framing of this seems to suggest that Capote is a douchebag, but since Charlotte spent the evening playing a heavily calculated game openly intended to dangle herself in front of him just enough to maintain interest, I'd call them even. Back inside the club, Samantha, who actually knows how to treat men like objects, hits on Carrie's mysterious Mr. Big, as he is now known, but is firmly rejected. Outside, Miranda attempts to similarly reject Skipper, but he appears to have decided that the opposite of a nice guy is one who doesn't understand the concept of the word no. Worryingly, Miranda is into this. Samantha ends up going home with Capote, because everyone's favourite snack after a night of heavy drinking is sloppy seconds. In the early hours, Carrie's failure to hail a cab is remedied by Mr. Big when she accepts a ride in his town car with a shocking disregard for her personal safety. Even Big's calamitous pickup lines, such as "so what have you been doing lately," aren't enough of a red flag to have her tucking and rolling out of the door. This may in part be because Carrie has clearly been waiting all night for somebody to ask her what she does for a living, which Big does. Depressingly, she introduces herself as a sexual anthropologist, which a sneering Big is quick to misinterpret as a euphemism for hooker. Carrie appears to find this charming, which is a good primer for how their long, storied, and largely gross history will play out as the series goes on. When Carrie tells Big about the experiment she's undertaking for her column, he misguidedly claims that she isn't like that. As a reminder, he bases this on literally 30 seconds of total interaction. He claims that he isn't like that either, a statement which would cause future Carrie to burst into indignant flames. Or at least it would if it wasn't for the fact that when it comes to men, she has the memory of a goldfish. One of those white ones that floats near the surface. When Big continues reaching by assuming that Carrie has never been in love, she reacts with what might be inexplicable offense. It's difficult to tell because just like all of her wild overreactions, she never actually explains it. As annoyingly gentle sax plays in the background, Carrie leaves the car but runs back to ask Big whether he's ever been in love. Again, why this is relevant to anything that the episode's supposed to be about is a bit of a mystery, but the way it's shot is clearly meant to evoke old-style Hollywood romances. This would prove a lot more effective if the characters weren't spouting absolute toss at each other. Big replies that he has been in love, but in a more forceful way that I can't say on YouTube because despite it being 2020, swearing is still a crime punishable by search algorithm banishment. His driver then pulls away at exactly the right moment, which can only mean that the entire thing was staged. Big is an evil genius, and what we just witnessed was him embarking on a decade-long gaslighting campaign. Carrie spins around to face the camera, ingenue style, and we're treated to a delightful freeze frame of her looking, I honestly couldn't tell you. Wistful, contemplative, mildly constipated, who knows. And with that, we end our first half hour with literally the worst people on the face of the planet. Join me next time as they continue to pile rotten furniture onto their raging personal dumpster fires. It's been a while, but welcome back to the Krusty Fox. We're on to Season 1, Episode 2 of Sex and the City. This one's titled Models and Mortals, because not content with ragging on men alone, Carrie's decided 2 episodes in that women also deserve a turn in her crosshairs. We begin with Miranda on a nearly blind date with excitable man-child Nick, who takes her to a friend's dinner party as his +1. He asks them all to name which celebrity, living or dead, they'd do the nasty with. Presumably he means getting with the dead ones when they were alive, but considering the extremely low bar this show sets for its men, who knows? Miranda's answer is Sean Connery. Yikes. Later, in the kitchen, some of Nick's supposed friends let Miranda in on a little secret. The only reason she got an invite was because Nick usually shows up with a model in tow. Sick of one-sided conversations, they ordered Nick to show up with someone capable of forming a sentence that doesn't involve the sound They clearly didn't think it all the way through, since without a model to make fun of all night, they have to get their kicks by negging the fuck out of Miranda's less runway-ready appearance instead. We, the viewers, simultaneously discover that Nick has been attending identical dinner parties with those models for some time, posing the exact same sex question again and again like a horny speaking spell someone's jammed a screwdriver into. By the time she and Nick are in a cab home, Mount Miranda is ready to blow. She confronts him, forcing him to admit his model fixation. In an attempt to smooth things over, Nick reminds Miranda that she had a nice evening, right up until his friends implied that she was an above-average orc. Significantly underestimating the amount of danger he's in, he assumes that this has earned him enough brownie points to go in for a kiss. We're not shown what happens next, but my guess is that Miranda paid the driver another $100 to dispose of Nick somewhere along the New Jersey Turnpike. Catching up on all the details so that she actually has something to put into her column this week, Carrie terms Nick and his ilk modelizers. Surprisingly, it's a real term, and describes the kind of man who thinks his penis gains an inch every time someone sees him out on the town with a beautiful woman. Carrie spins what she thinks is a fantastic original metaphor about Manhattan being a safari, where modelizers come to seek their prey. In an early sign of the sour grapes to come, she writes off all models as shallow, materialistic jungle animals. At another of the 4 ladies eating for a small village but never gaining weight hangouts, Miranda makes the first of her many calls for men to be shot on sight. I'd advise against turning this into a drinking game because you will 100% die long before any given season is over. You might not even live to see the end of certain episodes. Samantha, hilariously, announces that many men have told her she looks like a model, and that must mean she is one. It's at times like this that you'd be forgiven for wondering if Samantha secretly hates a lot of them and is purely there to give them a shove whenever their self-esteem is on a cliff edge. Carrie tells us in standard narcissistic voiceover that bringing up this topic is a good way to spice up a dull night. So not only is she also trolling her friends, but finds them boring. Nobody should be friends with Carrie. Because even an overly critical stopped clock is right twice a day, Carrie eventually stumbles upon a good point about the futility of beauty standards. But that glimmer of sense flickers out as quickly as you might expect. All except Samantha, obviously, name things about their bodies that make them feel self-conscious. These mostly imagined imperfections are somehow the fault of the models, who the four of them assume, in a stunning display of ignorant jealousy, don't think of themselves the same way. Carrie takes it upon herself to ponder the question, how powerful is beauty? Very, Carrie. It's very powerful. You just discussed how powerful it was with those three friends you barely tolerate because their love lives are the source of your inexplicably steady income. The less said about this episode's main talking heads section, the better. Just like the last episode, the women proclaim their superiority over men, in this case seducing them into opening their wallets, and the men downplay the importance of a woman's intelligence while generously acknowledging that it exists. FYI, one of the models interviewed is called Xandrella, with an X. If you've ever met a Xandrella in real life, I'd love to hear from you so that you can tell me all about the fairy tale kingdom you escaped from. Carrie actually does some journalistic work next, to the surprise of everyone, and going off her snooty attitude, nobody more so than herself. She interviews a man ironically named Barkley because he wastes no time in comparing models to dogs. Carrie pretends to disapprove, as if she hadn't just referred to them as beasts of the rainforest herself. You might think that some offensive misogyny was the worst Barkley would have to offer, but this is Sex and the City, my friends. He one-ups himself by showing Carrie a wall of TVs which contain what he calls his art. Videos of himself making the beast with two backs with numerous models. As if that isn't bad enough, it's fairly clear that the women didn't consent to being filmed and almost certainly don't know the tapes exist. Or, for that matter, are being casually shown to nosy, judgmental journalists. You'd expect Carrie to be outraged, right? Smash the TV sets, storm out, call the police? Nah, of course she doesn't. What Carrie can't believe about the situation is how many models Barkley's managed to lure into his candid camera boudoir. She lights a cigarette and seems disturbingly turned on by what she's discovered. Because the only woman Carrie ever really shows up for is Carrie. To cleanse herself of those sexual thoughts, Carrie meets up with her rent-a-loser friend, Skipper Johnston, who looks like a 6-foot-tall flaccid penis that went shopping at a thrift store. Skipper is now obsessed with Miranda, having had one appalling date with her in the previous episode. That nightmare scenario ended in a no-means-yes kiss, which, if she's a Bond fan, probably explains her Sean Connery crush. Miranda's successful ghosting of Skipper ever since now has him doubting his romantic prowess. Carrie seems to have learned the wrong lesson from Miranda's negging experience, because when she half-heartedly tries to reassure Skipper by telling him that he's adorable, you know it's a read. He then whips out one of the house bricks that used to pass for phones in the 90s and tells Carrie to call Miranda back for him, like she's going to be able to psychically tell it isn't him on the other end this time. When he's predictably screened again, he grabs the phone back and unleashes one of the most embarrassingly inept attempts at coercion I've ever seen. If Charlotte considers herself the show's optimistic Disney princess, then Skipper is its incel prince. If someone told him there was a cursed unconscious woman in the woods he had unsupervised access to, he'd break the sound barrier getting there. Carrie smugly looks into the camera and declares that there's a curse on the head of anyone who tries to fix up their friends. This is our first example of Carrie managing the impressive feat of gaslighting herself, since her self-confessed reason for pairing them up just one episode ago was because she knew Miranda would hate Skipper. Because the only person Carrie truly does favours for is Carrie. Bored and in need of more people to judge, Carrie attends a fashion show with her good, terrible friend Stanford Blur. Because it's literally all the show ever gives him to do, Stanford is ogling a male model he refers to as The Bone, an underwear model so named for his impressive credentials between me down there. The Bone, whose gifted nethers must be the universe's way of apologising for making his real name Derek, committed some kind of unspeakably horrific crime in a past life and so now has to be Stanford's client. Exactly what Stanford's job entails beyond pestering his clients sexually and touching them without asking remains unclear for the rest of the series. And in case you think I direct too many accusations at Carrie, Stanford goes for gold here in the problematic Olympics when he claims that nobody with model good looks could possibly be straight. Ergo, in Stanford's eyes, all gay men are beautiful. He fails to account for himself in this, of course, because Stanford on a good day looks like a mole that tunneled into an apprentice designer's offcuts bin. Samantha's already sitting right by the runway, of course, because it's an underwear show, and she can detect when a man's junk is behind one layer of fabric or less, like a beagle at the airport can sniff out a slab of devil's dandruff. And yes, I just made a dog comparison. I'm no better than Barkley. Speaking of, Barkley arrives, presumably in need of a place to hide until his arrest warrant expires. After establishing that he isn't gay, Samantha chooses to take Carrie's sudden disapproval of him as a challenge, one which, naturally, she eagerly accepts. Later, at a random party, of which 90s New York seemingly had an endless supply, Carrie stops cramming mini pastries into the void where all her calories go long enough to run into Mr. Big again. Carrie describes Big as out of her league based on his successful career and attractiveness. Set your timers because this self-deprecation lasts all of 60 seconds. Big admits to Carrie that he started reading her column after their brief, weird meeting in the previous episode. He describes it as cute. It's clear that to Carrie, he might as well have popped a squat on the newspaper right in front of her. After briefly dissing modelizers, Carrie realizes that she's chatting with the enemy, when Big reveals that he brought one of the show's models as his date. She speculates, bitterly, that some modelizers are only in it for the validation. Then she lets slip the real reason she's writing her article. She's condemning modelizers to counteract her own feelings of inferiority next to the kind of women they're interested in. I'm not sure what she'd like models to do about their genetically predisposed attractiveness, though this is Carrie we're talking about, so she'd probably consider things even if they let her use their faces as an ashtray. The writers of the show then take a turn shooting themselves in the foot. Carrie muses to herself about how she left her vanity behind at 30 when she realised that she could no longer be bothered with the superficial. In all likelihood, this was exactly who the writers intended her to be at first. Self-involved, but also unassuming, and not overly concerned with her appearance. Later in the series, when they realised that Carrie was becoming a style icon, that tune quickly changed. Suddenly she's whining endlessly about shoes and bankrupting herself to overfill a closet that must have the internal dimensions of the TARDIS. Carrie doesn't have the energy to be superficial, like I don't have the energy to read complimentary YouTube comments. Hint hint. Samantha rocks up and asks Carrie whether Barkley might have mistaken her for a model. Carrie wisely dodges the question, like the loaded gun it is, and finally having it contextualised by someone she holds a faint ember of affection for, warns her about the Wall of Conquests. Except what Carrie sees as a red flag, Samantha sees as a green light, and she happily trots back over to Barkley with a new mission in mind. As Carrie leaves, she's stopped by Derek, who has been abandoned by Stanford in favour of an indecent assault on a Versace model. Derek asks to come home with her to escape the crowds, which mentally puts him somewhere between frightened child and unsocialised puppy, but it doesn't put Carrie off. Because, you guessed it, after spending a whole episode moaning about modelizers, Carrie wants to go home with someone pretty to feel better about herself too. Never let your supposedly lofty values get in the way of a quick self-esteem boost. They do go home together, but not for what you might think. Instead, Derek just wants to talk to someone about feeling lonely in the big city. Carrie, meanwhile, suffers a total empathy failure and quietly gloats over the somehow unexpected news that sexy people feel bad sometimes too. They fall asleep in Carrie's bed, Derek taking the opportunity to get a single night's sleep that isn't interrupted by Stanford climbing a fire escape to mush his naked body up against the bedroom window. Because there is no God, we then get to check back in with Miranda and Skipper, who bump into each other at a late night bodega. Miranda's sole purchase is cat food, which you don't need me to make a joke about because it's perfect as it is. Skipper, who increasingly talks to women like a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle talks to pizza, questions her elusive behaviour in typically incel fashion. Specifically, he wants to know if she treats all men this way. To remove any doubt, by this way, he means not immediately getting matching genital tattoos after a first date. Probably only just holding back the urge to scream cowabunga, Skipper continues to be the king of right place, right time when he accidentally keys into Miranda's model-damaged self-esteem with a fancy compliment. She responds with less of an invitation and more of an instruction for him to spend the night with her. Like a first-time fisherman confused as to what the pull on his line means, Skipper momentarily weighs whether he'd rather stay and buy breakfast cereal. Samantha, meanwhile, makes it back to Barkley's budget bunga bunga barn and wastes no time in asking for her close-up. It turns out that he doesn't consider her a model after all, but gent that he is, will make an exception for her. This would have been a killing blow to the other three, but Samantha went in there with a mission and she accomplished it, so that's all that matters to her. Like the A-Team, Samantha loves it when a plan comes together. Or, for that matter, when a man comes wherever. The next morning, Stanford calls Carrie to find out where his victim-to-be ran off to. Still desperately looking for a way into Derek's already at capacity pants, Stanford's response when told about the events of the night before is to imply that platonic bed sharing is some kind of big gay smoking gun. Truly the absolute worst. Because it must be Stalker Saturday, Big later shows up unannounced at the cafe Carrie told him earlier that she sometimes works from. In a misguided attempt at damage control after ditching her the night before, Big basically confirms Carrie's worst fears when he implies that models offer a good time, but regular-looking people with a passable sense of humour offer a long time. Humble words indeed from the man who probably just bundled that good time into a cab headed for the nearest pharmacy. Somehow his bare minimum effort pays off and Carrie is happy once again to have the vague and slightly insulting attention of a man so slimy that he could hit Mach 3 on a dry slip and slide. And that's all for the second ramble through the dense and thorny underbrush of a 90s New York that didn't actually exist. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and we're on to Season 1, Episode 3 of Sex and the City. Buckle up kids, this one's called Bay of Married Pigs, so you know we're in for a treat. We're also going to start tracking the rules of Carrie. Last time we covered off 3 of them. Rule 1, nobody should be friends with Carrie. Rule 2, because the only woman Carrie ever really shows up for is Carrie. And Rule 3, because the only person Carrie truly does favours for is Carrie. Carrie begins this episode by escaping to the Hamptons for the weekend, courtesy of her friend Patience. Carrie caveats their friendship with the admission that if Patience and husband Peter didn't own a house by the beach, she'd hate them. Because, as we all know by now, unless Carrie wants something from you, you can fuck right off. Carrie claims that house guests of hanky-panky starved Hamptons couples are required to pay for their weekends away with tales of their sexploits. In Carrie's world, every marriage comes with a mandatory no-sex clause, unless that sex is being relayed verbally by a columnist who probably knows less about it now than she did when she started having it. Because Carrie is to sexual liberation what a golden retriever is to an accountancy firm. The next morning, Carrie's energy boost comes not from a cup of coffee, but from her fight-or-flight response kicking in when she's confronted by Peter's John Thomas as he waits pantless outside her bedroom door. As she does with most crimes, Carrie treats this as more of a social faux pas than indecent exposure. That said, she does immediately tell Patience, whose frustration suggests she's running out of friends her husband hasn't waved his willy at. Bundled onto a bus to New York and low-key regretting having ruined her weekend away with honesty, Carrie meets up with Charlotte, Miranda and Samantha for lunch. Off-screen, Patience told Carrie that the reason the whole thing upset her so much is something Carrie, as a single woman, couldn't understand. This triggers Miranda, who, as the only single lawyer at her firm, believes that married women see the single as their enemies. Since Miranda reacts to affection with all the warmth of a cornered opossum, there's a good chance that her co-workers consider her the enemy for other reasons. Samantha boldly claims that married women are constantly on guard in case one of those evil single homewreckers swoops in and steals their husbands. Keep that in mind because she later proves exactly why this should be. Charlotte, who thinks of herself as already engaged to a man who has so far managed to successfully hide from her, disagrees. We know by now, of course, that Charlotte thinks about marriage with the same frequency that men think about sex, 2 very different relationship milestones which can both be successfully accomplished by slipping a ring onto a finger. Sensing an easy route to a week's worth of work, Carrie whips all of this up into an assumed war between the married and the single. As far as extrapolation goes, that's like eating bad chicken once and assuming that all farmers are trying to kill you. Probably because Carrie is paid by the word, not by the brain cell. Then there's some more talking head rubbish. Rather than waste oxygen on it, I'll let you in on a secret. These little interludes are only there to back up whichever loony tangent Carrie is on this week. If she decided that men are literally dogs in pink flesh suits, the interviewees would run around barking and humping each other's legs. Stanford, fresh from a shift posing riddles to travellers crossing bridges, manifests later to offer his opinion. He believes that New York's increasingly coupled up gay community is ostracising him for the crime of being single. As if by magic, Joe, an old friend of Carrie's, and his husband Lou, who looks like an iguana with a part-time job at a Levi's store, happen to pass by. Joe's one of those people who will aggressively update you on his life as if he's certain you've been talking about him behind his back and needs you to know how well he's doing. He bluntly informs Carrie that he's come out as gay and is happily married, leaving her momentarily thrown because Carrie doesn't get gay men who aren't stereotypes or accessories. When Stanford isn't brought into the conversation within the first 6 words, he interjects, while pulling a face that was made to be shoved into a tank of wasabi. Joe and Lou, after confirming Carrie's singledom, ask her to donate one of her eggs so that they can have a baby. It's clear that Joe hasn't seen Carrie in a long time when he specifies his need for a top-notch donor because, as far as we know, the only thing she's been on top of recently probably ran on batteries. In the spirit of all of her best overblown crusades, Carrie takes this as a new attack on singles. There is literally nothing which Carrie can't twist into her current narrative. A butterfly can flap its wings in Peking, and in Central Park, Carrie is already telling a pretzel vendor that it's a comment on her choice of tampon brand. Because everything is about Carrie, especially when it isn't. Across town, Miranda, the lawyer that fun forgot, is reluctantly attending her firm's annual softball game with a level of negative energy she usually reserves for dating. A good game seemingly results in a promotion, probably leading most of the past MVPs to get disbarred the first time they referred to a judge as broseph. Miranda agreed to allow colleague Jeff to set her up on a blind date for the event, which turns out to be with a woman called Sid. When Miranda reveals his ignorant mistake, Carrie's voiceover labels her as brave, as though the truth will cause Sid to transform into a were-lesbian and start biting chunks out of spectators. When Miranda plays well, I'd guess because she was hoping to crush some testicles with a power slide into home base, the CEO mistakes she and Sid for a couple. He invites them to a dinner party, and with the faint scent of power wafting into her nostrils, she seizes the opportunity and accepts for them both without asking. Elsewhere, Carrie decides to investigate her imaginary Cold War further by interrogating another couple she's friends with, David and Lisa. David and Lisa are objectively fucking awful, so it's no surprise that their pairing is Carrie's favourite. These two are the kind of couple who perform a bland, playful ribbing of each other for everyone else's benefit. Carrie, of course, likes this because they pretend to hate being a couple as much as she hates it for real. Accidentally getting revenge, they invite their friend Sean along to meet Carrie. This annoys her because she wants people to listen quietly to her whinge about being single without having the audacity to help her actually do something about it. Sean signals his openness to marriage almost immediately, which for once Carrie correctly identifies as a red flag. They embark on a series of dates despite her not being particularly interested. It's probably because at this point he seems like a normal, if a little intense, prospect, and of course, Carrie doesn't do relationships that aren't screwed from the start. Later, Carrie drags herself to her unwanted beau's housewarming party. She lures Charlotte there with the prospect of bachelors of an equal or greater eligibility to Sean. Samantha was probably already scoping the place out because she gets a downstairs tingle whenever more than a dozen men gather in an enclosed space. Unfortunately for both of them, the party is filled with married couples who the show frames as dowdy losers for the high crime of having their lives together. Sean meets Charlotte and Samantha for the first time and seems able to identify them by how much cleavage they're showing, which raises some interesting questions about how Carrie is describing her supposed friends to other people. Sean wastes no time in showing Carrie and Charlotte his office, which will one day apparently be his kids' room. As if to compound Carrie's horror, he reveals that he's collecting baby paraphernalia. If you listen closely, you can hear Charlotte's ovaries pulsating. While this is going on, Samantha has a tequila-fueled breakdown in the kitchen after realising that she's already been to bed with half of the married men in attendance. After discovering from other guests with some serious boundary issues that Sean has his own business, $300,000 in the bank, and an apparently talented wang, Carrie descends to a fresh circle of hell when Patience and Peter reappear. Because in the 90s, instead of laughing at your friends' crap parties when the photos hit Instagram, you actually had to go and see it for yourself. A wasted Samantha, with perfect timing, stumbles over and reveals that everyone knows about the impromptu morning review staged by Peter's one-eyed milkman. Across town, Miranda, deep into her lesbian cosplay, attends dinner with Sid but eventually admits the truth to her mostly unbothered boss. She does gamely try kissing Sid, but only reaffirms her straightness in a move that manages to frame sexual orientation as potentially changeable if you're desperate enough. Charlotte takes Samantha back to her place to sleep it off, but doesn't account for her friend's dissatisfaction at attending a party full of untouchable men. This manifests itself in the early hours when she sneaks down to the lobby in her lingerie, retrieves the Irish doorman, and uses him to test the stain resistance of Charlotte's couch. Back at Sean's wife trap, Carrie tries to let him down gently by admitting for the first time that she doesn't know what she wants. And because there's no skipper this week, Sean decides to pick up the incel slack.
He frustratedly moans about not understanding women, who claim to want marriage and children but won't accept his pitiful offers to provide them. Even if Carrie did want to settle down there and then, leaking your desperate loneliness all over your date and then getting angry when they aren't into it is like filling a jar with piss and having a go at them for not drinking it when they're thirsty. To shut him up, Carrie proves that she's learned nothing about meddling in her friends' love lives by passing him off to commitment enthusiast Charlotte. Charlotte eventually breaks it off with him when they disagree over their choice of fine china, which isn't the worst thing she'll ever do, but at least proves that she's as up for a bit of self-sabotage as the rest of them. Wandering the streets at night and pondering the war between marrieds and singles that she made up, Carrie manages to compare the issue to the Irish Troubles. You might not have had Wikipedia in the 90s, Carrie, but you had libraries. Come on. She decides not to spend so much time worrying about it, and rather than do her job by finishing the column, goes to the movies with her friends instead. There's a poster outside of the cinema for 1998's Godzilla, which means this episode manages to cram 2 New York-based shows into 23 minutes. Impressive stuff. And that's it for this installment.
Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and we're on to Season 1, Episode 4 of Sex and the City. Today, Carrie's asking the question, are younger men an intoxicating drug? No. The answer's no. But let's humour her anyway. Here's a question for you first. If you absolutely had to pick one, which of the Sex and the City girls are you and why? Drop your answers in the comments and I'll cover the best ones in the next video. I'm a Miranda, for reasons I will never reveal. Anyway, Carrie starts this episode off by reciting the opening of a fairy tale, but don't get too excited for her prospects because it turns out she's talking about Mr. Big. She reads meaning into the fact that they keep bumping into each other, going so far as to imply that occasional meet-cutes constitute accidental dates. By this logic, she must be dating half of her apartment block. For a change, they decide to meet up on purpose at the opening of a hot new Manhattan restaurant. Carrie, who has been dying to get big on his own for a while now, decides to invite him to an event with literally everyone she knows. Obviously. Charlotte rocks up with new boyfriend Brian, who apparently has her big 3. Looks, manners, and money. As if every other woman is looking for a destitute cave troll who needs to be house-trained before you can let him near your best rug. The ladies use Big's lateness as an excuse to begin a premature autopsy of what exactly is going on between he and Carrie. For her part, Carrie is annoyed that he referred to their meeting as a drinks thing rather than the D word. Presumably she means date rather than anything else, confirmed by the fact that Charlotte's head didn't spin 360 degrees and roll off her neck. Unfortunately, Miranda brought Skipper. She insists it's just a casual thing, somehow forgetting that she's brought an infamously insecure and lonely man on what is, for all intents and purposes, a triple date. When a check of Carrie's voicemails reveals that Big isn't coming after all, she whines about how childish the whole thing seems. As a reminder, the childishness Carrie is referring to is completely her doing, is in her own head, and to her that somehow means that it's being done to her by Big. Because nothing is ever Carrie's fault. If you're wondering where Samantha is in all of this, don't worry, she's at a table touching up the young chef, John. She introduces Carrie and Miranda to his friend, the equally young and handsome Sam. Sam, played with stoned out of his mind delight by Timothy Oliphant, dutifully heads to the bar to get martinis while Carrie stares longingly at his dumper. While he's gone, Skipper emerges from whichever darkened corner he's been watching them from and cuts a path through the crowd with his big slack jaw. He hands Miranda a drink she didn't want, which she angrily accepts with the same level of gratitude she has for just about anything. Cue Sam returning with the martini she actually wanted because he knows the barman. Skipper stares at Sam from an uncomfortably close distance, and in all honesty, I'm not sure whether it's because he feels upstaged or, like a dog accepting its lower place on the food chain, he's fighting the urge to roll over and show Sam his red rocket. Just as Carrie's admiring Sam's tongue piercing in a totally normal way, by which I mean shoving her fingers into his mouth, Big unexpectedly shows up. When he ducks back out again just as quickly, Carrie bitterly muses about the difficulty she has in working out men over the age of 40. It's as if on the last day of their 39th year, they form a cocoon, melt down into goo, and reform into creatures lacking the willingness to be her playthings. Because if you aren't willing to play Carrie's games, then what is even the point of you? As luck would have it, Sam has no such limitations. This could be down to his younger age, or the fact that his mannerisms imply that he hasn't been sober since his 9th birthday. Whatever the case, all Carrie needs him for is to get a quick self-esteem boost. She grabs Samantha, and along with Sam and John, they head to a less tired club for drinks. Carrie's reservations about the entirely 20-something clientele aren't helped by Samantha's insistence that they can pass for the same age. Admittedly, Samantha's relentless confidence is one of the show's most redeeming features, but this is a stretch even by her standards. The two ladies wind up mounting their young steeds, and Carrie road tests Sam's piercing by eating his face with the sloppy tenacity of a St. Bernard shotgunning a bowl of porridge. The next morning, Carrie is awoken by a phone call from Samantha, who evidently needs to inform someone about her marathon session with John before she's even left the bed it happened in. An obviously jealous Carrie suffers through it for a while before finding a familiar distraction: herself, when she discovers Sam's phone number scrawled on her arm. Later on, she tries desperately to find a hook to turn this unspectacular set of events into another column. She settles on men in their 20s being a new designer drug for older women, wondering aloud whether being with them might constitute the elders getting into something they can't handle. Now, I normally wouldn't spend much time on the talking head section of the episode, but this one's special. A procession of men under 30 step up to explain why they like older women. The usual expected grossness ensues: their experience, they're grateful, they remind them of their mothers. Perhaps sensing a kinship with his fellow Oedipus complex sufferers, Skipper appears. I will admit that up until this point I'd forgotten he was supposed to be in his 20s and not some ageless time thief sent to torment deserving women. He claims that 30-something women know who they are and what they want, which is why he's attracted to them. Given that his target of choice is Miranda, that's a fair statement. She does know exactly what she wants. She wants to push Skipper off the roof of her building and make it look like an accident. Later, Carrie and Miranda wander down the street and discuss the lack of available men in their 30s in New York. Miranda jokes that Giuliani had them all removed along with the homeless. Fast forward 25 years and the only thing Rudy's removing are his own pants if an underage woman passes within 10 feet of him. Allegedly. Carrie gets another invite for drinks with Big, but while she's getting ready, Charlotte calls to tell her that Practically Perfect Brian made a very politely worded request for them to try, bringing some furniture in through the freight entrance, if you catch my drift. Charlotte is absolutely horrified, as you might expect from her. Carrie gathers the girls on a cab ride to her date with Big to provide advice, most of which ends up suggesting that Brian should be allowed to hike the dirt trail. Charlotte evidently hasn't had a request like this before and is scandalized that a woman of her education would be expected to let her boyfriend mash her dinner so early in the relationship. Maybe it's in the small print on Ivy League degrees. Carrie makes it to her drink thing with Big to discover that his recently separated friend Jack has crashed it. Angry that Big hadn't ignored a crying friend to spend time with her, she conveniently forgets that she brought her own crushes to their last attempted date, passive-aggressively tells him to have a guy's night, and leaves. Do as Carrie says, not as Carrie does. You fuck. Turns out, the single bill which Carrie gave Big to buy another round was apparently all she had on her. So Carrie had no intention of paying for a single thing the whole time she was out, and sure as shit isn't going to get more from an ATM now, despite moaning about having to walk in $400 shoes. She stomps 48 blocks back to the 20-somethings bar to find Sam, an absolutely definitely not crazy thing to do, and wastes no time in eating his face. She craves the designer drug she made up, she says, which looks more and more like a euphemism for any male validation with every passing second. At the same time, Charlotte deals with her own relationship crisis. Brian is ready to politely gun his hog up the Hershey Highway, but with an impassioned speech about her relationship goals, Charlotte tells him no. Brian, who obviously couldn't care less as long as he still gets lucky, manages to make Charlotte think he's being super romantic by comparison when he asks if they can just fuck the regular way. Samantha is having another roll in the hay with Chef John when his pillow talk takes an abrupt left turn into commenting on her neck wrinkles. She swears off men in their 20s right there and then, something which fans of the series know lasts about as long for her as a bumper packet Trojan. Carrie, meanwhile, is busy back at Sam's place. She has a euphoric night with him, waxing lyrical about the benefits of sensitive, attentive younger men. She wakes up the next morning to discover that her night also featured a regrettably more literal roll in the hay, because without her sex goggles on, Carrie realizes that Sam lives in what is essentially a slightly more spacious gerbil cage. What I think the show is trying to do here is position Sam's cool attractiveness up to now as being down to Carrie's own projection, because Morning Sam is an idiotic loser who Carrie can't wait to get away from. Mind you, Sam's apartment is absolutely littered with junk, and Carrie had to climb up a little loft ladder to get into his bedroom. She can try to pretend as much as she wants that she had no idea what she was walking into, but she 100% did. The final straw is when he uses the last of the toilet paper as a coffee filter. Without putting too fine a point on it, if the morning was Carrie's first visit to the bathroom in that apartment, then she needs to get herself some cranberry juice ASAP. Emphasis on the P. After escaping Sam's hoarder nest, Carrie openly uses the experience as an excuse to cross-addict from younger men to expensive shoes. This episode is the first time she makes a big deal about footwear and its cost, but don't worry if you missed it because she very rarely shuts up about it from now on. On her way back from spending money she doesn't have on shoes she doesn't need, she bumps into Big, yet again. He invites her out for the umpteenth time, on this occasion for dinner. Carrie manages a relatively breezy and cool acceptance, which she ruins, because of course she does, by looking back as she walks away just as she's about to cross the street. Because nothing says good dating prospect like getting ragdolled by a cab in front of your love interest and having to ask the waiter to liquidize your overpriced seafood sampler at Balthazar.
Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and we're finally onto episode 5 of Sex and the City, the power of female sex. Before that though, last time I asked you to tell me which of the girls you're the most like and why. Thanks to everyone who left their comments, but my favourite came courtesy of Aroma YT, who said, Miranda when I'm sober, Samantha when I'm drunk. Iconic. Aspirational. Probably confusing to bystanders. Love it. Check the comments for this video's question, and I can't wait to see what you come up with this time. We open on Carrie mulling over who the most powerful woman in New York is. One candidate is apparently Rosie O'Donnell, whose only power struggle these days is with her own resemblance to Tony Soprano. The real most powerful woman in New York is apparently the hostess at Balzac, a parody of real-life 90s hotspot Balthazar, the kind of place you go to announce to everyone you know that you're a wanker without actually having to say it out loud. Carrie and Samantha, cosmos in hand, are impatiently waiting for a seat. Unfortunately, the hostess isn't playing ball. Zach. Samantha's furious that the jaunty hat-wearing hostess won't seat them and believes it's because they aren't men. Having just complained that she didn't have a spare $50 to bribe the hostess, Carrie later decides to splurge on some truly horrific furry Dolce & Gabbana shoes. As if judged and found wanting by a higher power with some actual taste, her credit card is declined. Luckily for Carrie, and unluckily for fans of stylish footwear everywhere, her old friend Amelita steps in with her boyfriend Carlo's credit card, a sentence which I challenge you to repeat accurately after 3 bottles of wine. Carrie puts up one of her less convincing efforts to stop the transaction, but as you might expect, ultimately grabs the shoes and dashes for the door before anyone has a chance to change their mind. Italian socialite Amelita, Carrie helpfully informs us, is what most people would consider Eurotrash, but Carrie thinks she's fun. Just in case you've forgotten, when Carrie deploys that kind of reasoning, it's usually a sign that her real interest is in what a person can do for her. Back home, Carrie, who we're supposed to sympathise with, thumbs through a bunch of unopened bills and tosses them in the trash. She has no time for adult responsibilities, you see, because encountering Amelita stimulated the part of her brain responsible for bullshit and gave her an idea for this week's column. More specifically, Amelita is this week's column. That's right, the old friend who just bought Carrie a pair of expensive shoes and saved her from public humiliation is in for a roasting. This week's topic in a nutshell? Is Amelita's sexual power over men basically fine, or is she a massive prostitute? Seriously, that's the question which Carrie only slightly more tactfully asks. Carrie decides to hold a poker night, partly to get her friends' input on the issue, and partly, amazingly, because she's hoping to win some money from them. While she's often benefiting at her friends' expense, it's rarely this brazen. She, Samantha, Miranda, and Charlotte discuss what is and isn't too far when it comes to a woman using her sexual power for material gain. Samantha believes that women should use whatever methods they can to get as far ahead as possible. Miranda draws the line at sleeping your way to the top. Charlotte, in a voice like a constipated Jiminy Cricket, wails that doing so would be exploitation. Except it turns out that Charlotte isn't so totally against the idea, because an extremely gross older artist named Neville Morgan recently invited her to a private viewing of his work. She feigns concern that any time spent together on his farm might be less to do with canvas and more to do with her ass. The conversation doesn't progress any further because the doorbell rings, unfortunately heralding the coming of the inevitable. Skipper. The first of his name. King of the incels and the thirsty men, protector of the seven virginities, the father of worms, the untouched, the shredder of nerves, arrives an hour earlier than planned. Full of fire, despite constantly inviting him to disappoint her, Miranda heads off with him regardless, Skipper following behind with his head bowed like an abused dog. When Carrie later attempts to retreat to bed, Amelita calls and invites her for a little midnight Balzac. Reluctantly, and only after establishing that someone else was paying, Carrie drags herself in her Dolce & Gabbana slippers down there. She's introduced to Gillies, a Parisian architect with the dress sense, haircut, and social skills of a 70s Bond henchman. Regardless, Carrie is somehow seduced by his continental charm. This occurs in spite of him staring at her like a serial killer, fighting the urge to wear her skin like a Halloween costume, and causes her to miss that the Balzac waiting staff are all pretentiously dressed in shirts made of tin foil. Walking home afterwards, Carrie lists Gillies' red flags as his nationality, recent divorce, and handsomeness. She misses the obvious fourth when he asks to see her again, because he's never seen New York with someone like her before. The next day, Skipper shows up at Carrie's apartment unannounced, as usual, to whinge about his addiction to simping over Miranda. She proposes that instead of afternoon hookups, Skipper should try to spend the night with Miranda without it turning physical. This leads him to probably the worst thing he ever says in the show. After they're together, he doesn't shower so that he can smell like her all day. Oh, de Miranda. When even Carrie recoils in disgust, you know you've got problems. Carrie spends the rest of her day making innocent Central Park bystanders throw up their pretzels by eating Gilly's face before retreating to his hotel to finish her meal. In the morning, a fully dressed Gillies wakes her up to bid farewell. After realizing that he left without getting her number, Carrie finds a thank you note and $1,000 sitting on the nightstand. Gillies thought she was a hooker. Lol. To be clear, the funny part of this isn't the sex work, which is serious business. The funny part is that of all the people to be mistaken for a sex worker, Carrie Bradshaw is not the one. Despite often holding herself back with judgment and spite, she's propelled forward by the delusion that she's a love guru. To find that so utterly lost in translation that a guy believed it was all transactional is about as bad as it gets in her world. Bewildered as to why anybody would think she was only out to drain a man's bank account, Carrie invites Samantha and Miranda to the hotel to order a room service breakfast at Gilly's expense, and discuss what to do with the fat wad of cash he left her. Charlotte, meanwhile, arrives on Neville's farm, and discovers that his latest exhibition is a barn full of painted mimsies. She gamely tries to maintain her composure as Neville leans against an 8-foot tuppence and drops C-bombs. In front of his unbothered wife/accomplice, Neville offers to sketch Charlotte's downstairs mix-up right then and there. Of course, prim, proper, prudish Charlotte would never let a total stranger stare into and draw a likeness of her panty hamster just because she wants to make a quick buck off him. Except she absolutely would. Back at Balzac, Samantha and Carrie are once again denied service by the same hostess in yet another minging hat. Enter Amelita, who looks like she's been secretly living at the restaurant and just emerged from underneath a nearby table. She introduces Carrie to another friendship group full of potential Johns with facial skin like a leather sofa in a youth hostel lobby. She briefly weighs the benefits of leaving New York and becoming a jet-setting sugar baby, but decides against it, suddenly finding a supply of integrity she's previously chosen not to call upon. In the toilets, she also manages to solve the hostess problem by furnishing her with a tampon in her hour of need. In case you're wondering, hanging around restrooms with a handful of feminine hygiene products is not a viable solution to any of life's problems, but you're welcome to give it a go and report back. At Charlotte's gallery, the friends gather to look at Neville's extensive study of the notorious VAG and try to guess which of them is hers. The painting in question is bluer than I would have liked and looks strikingly like an apple core. What that says about Charlotte and her fine china, I will leave to your imagination. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're taking a long, hard look at Sex in the City Season 1, Episode 6, titled Secret Sex. 2 weeks ago, I had my picture taken, says Carrie, to open the episode. For most people, this would be the intro to a story about getting some new headshots or posing for a friend who's into photography, but not Carrie. Carrie's version of getting her picture taken involves donning a nude nightdress and splaying herself across a bed, the pretense for which is promoting her column on the side of a bus. In Carrie's world, of course, this is all entirely correct. In the average New Yorker's world, the only way they're likely to get spread across the side of a bus is if they stand too close to the road as it pulls over. It's a short scene, and I don't want to dwell on it for too long, but the montage of Carrie's photo shoot is hilarious. It features the kind of faux quirky behaviour usually only seen in Liam Neeson's home movies before he sets out to avenge a family member's murder. But never fear, Carrie's brief ascension to the kind of life she spends her time and career endlessly judging others for is short-lived. She quickly returns to her first love, roasting her confusingly patient friends in voiceover. Carrie's on her way to her first date with Mr. Big, you see, and rather than feel a twinge of gratitude that her 3 besties gave up their Friday nights to help her get ready, she instead accuses them of not having social lives of their own. Quick reminder, the group Carrie's chewing out here includes Samantha, who proves beyond a shadow of a doubt through the rest of the series that there are a million places she could and would probably prefer to be at any given time. Mind you, I don't want to let Samantha off the hook quite so fast here. Carrie walks in wearing the gossamer thin piece of fabric some sick individual at the photo shoot told her was couture, and Samantha fawns over it. I'm left to assume that she just needed to stop Carrie in her tracks, since if she moved any closer then the 2 Phillips head screwdrivers she has in place of nipples might have cut them all up. Charlotte, of course, is the lone dissenting voice. She asks Carrie if wearing a naked dress means she's planning on sleeping with Big. Carrie acts as though the thought never crossed her mind. She then gives them all whiplash as she changes lanes to instead say that her appearance for the date is just the trailer. She doesn't clarify which movie it's the trailer for, but all signs point to Fatal Attraction. Charlotte presses further, saying that Carrie should keep Big in a holding pattern for 5 days before even thinking about putting out. She then says that the third date would also be too soon. Charlotte, bless her, doesn't seem to make the connection between her own singledom and her apparent expectation that she's taken from date 1 to 3 inside of a working week. The girls banter back and forth, covering the usual ground: Charlotte the conservative, Samantha the progressive, Miranda the moderate. Then Carrie chimes in with her own offering. There's something to be said for restraint. Because I'm sure the dozen regular readers of her column are clawing at the shutters of the newsstand every week for their next dose of restraint. On her way down to meet Big at the door, Carrie stops for a quick fourth-wall breaking confessional and top-up for her cavernous stores of hypocrisy. She admits that she's dying to sleep with Big but plans to hold out because it's the more mature route. Once again, this is a sex columnist basically saying that wanting or having it on your own timetable is a stupid idea. As expected, she breezes right past the fact that she'd just lied to her friends again, and in doing so made Samantha and to a lesser degree Miranda comparatively sound like they'd just ridden a wave of bodily fluids out of the backseat of a car down at the docks. Once inside of Big's town car, Carrie flashes him a bit of thigh and he cheerily informs her that he's perfectly capable of restraining himself. Yikes. Not that this sort of behaviour has really gone anywhere in the last 20 years, but his shit-eating grin suggests that he thinks this deserves some kind of award. But not to worry, they immediately and consensually jump each other's bones and head back to Big's place, where they spend the night playing hide the probably misshapen and kind of grey sausage. Having gotten what she wanted, Carrie then immediately resumes her usual game playing by refusing to be the first to speak afterwards. She remains bottom of the leaderboard though, so not only blurts out that she didn't mean for them to sleep together, more lies, but asks Big the kind of question which nobody wants a real answer to immediately post-coitus. What do you think? Big, who at this point evidently doesn't fully comprehend who and what he's dealing with, tries to dodge the question with an impromptu Szechuan dinner. Carrie's increasingly frantic paranoia is their third wheel, as she sachets into the restaurant wondering whether it's all a big plot to stop her spending the night at his place. Just when it seems that she's about to shake uncontrollably and bite him like an overstimulated chihuahua, Big is saved when Carrie spots a friend, Mike Singer. Carrie says that she's known Mike for 10 years, but they never did it because they want to know each other for another 10. There must be a lost episode somewhere because you'll never see or hear from Mike again after this. Mike is dining with a lady who, sitting near Carrie's peanut smuggling dress, we're obviously supposed to see as plain and unassuming, but by comparison, she actually looks like a nice regular woman in a room full of sociopaths. Mike's discomfort is palpable as he first tries to ignore Carrie's intrusion and then begrudgingly allows her to introduce herself to the lady in question. He dispatches her back to Big with a twitchy promise to call her later. Carrie is confused. Why wouldn't Mike want to introduce her to his date? Here's a thought, Carrie. Not every table in every restaurant will be filled with people whose bucket list is topped with the entry, "Exchange pleasantries with Z-list columnist." Of course, this is Carrie's show when all is said and done, and a neurotic stopped clock is still right twice a day, which means that ultimately her concern over Mike's dismissiveness is well placed in spite of her belief that every room in Manhattan is on the edge of its seat waiting for her arrival. But we'll get to that. That same night, we're told, something absolutely amazing happens to Miranda. To the surprise of literally nobody, that something turns out to be her roundhouse kicking a guy in the face. It might have been a gym accident, but anyone with a passing knowledge of Miranda's feelings towards men would be forgiven for wondering whether she hopes to end any given evening by sending one to the coma ward. She at least pretends to be sorry, and her victim, the I assume coincidentally named Ted Baker, walks her home. Ted, who clearly has a death wish, decides to dangle his nethers over the lion's den by asking Miranda out on a date. In voiceover, Carrie unironically lists Ted's pros: a sports medicine doctor, owner of an apartment overlooking the Natural History Museum, unmarried. I'm not saying people don't act this way, but there has to be a better system for finding a husband than running through his features like you're shopping for a new laptop. The next day, Carrie makes a beeline for Mike to find out what the deal was with his perfectly normal date Libby. She goes with him to pick out sheets, a task which apparently requires them to climb into a showroom bed together. Carrie runs through a list of potential issues with the relationship before Mike finally tells his painful tale. Poor Mike, fresh from a breakup, met Libby while she was handing out cheese samples in a shop. Advertising director Mike, seemingly unaware that Sex and the City's version of New York has enough carbon copies of him to put Xerox to shame, whinges about how Libby isn't beautiful or unique enough for him to be seen with her in public. Boo-hoo. As is customary, Carrie sets a new land speed record getting back home to turn a friend's personal life into her latest column. She ponders how many people out there having great sex but are ashamed of who they're having it with. She poses the same question to Samantha, who quickly realizes that she correctly doesn't feel any shame for any of her bedroom encounters. Much as I think Samantha is the only person on the show who ever displays a consistent level of common sense, she does suffer a rare misfire here when she suggests that Big should join the four friends when they gather on the bus route to view Carrie's upcoming ad. Samantha, taking some pot-stirring lessons from Carrie, then casually asks whether Charlotte ever mentioned a rabbi she was involved with. The scent of easy copy in her nostrils, Carrie races down to Charlotte's art gallery and demands to know more. Charlotte testily informs her that he wasn't a rabbi, but a Hasidic folk artist from Brooklyn. We get a flashback which implies that Charlotte's interest in the artist was half to do with his talent and half to do with some bizarre mid-30s religious rebellion against her father. Electra complex be damned. Knowing full well who she's dealing with, Charlotte makes Carrie swear that none of this will make it to print, and we get an unintentionally hilarious smash cut to Carrie probably doing exactly that back home. She's distracted from her newest betrayal by a call from Big, inviting her to a proper first date. On said date, they abandon all self-awareness to discuss how much prestige Carrie's bus advert will have based on the route it takes. She's in the middle of inviting Big to the bus viewing when a friend of his interrupts them. Big awkwardly fails to introduce Carrie and then compounds his obvious embarrassment by taking her back to the same Szechuan place they went last time. There are many things you can do to Carrie which she'll shrug off easily. Objectify her, use her, demean her, all things she can spin into positives given enough time. But the one thing you absolutely cannot do to Carrie Bradshaw is deprive her of the attention which is the source of all her powers. She makes her excuses and calls Mike, asking why he chose that particular restaurant for dinner with Libby. He confirms her worst fears, namely that it's the perfect place to go with somebody you're embarrassed to be seen with. When he realizes what that says about Carrie and Big's dynamic, Mike laughs in a way that shows just how much those in her orbit are rooting for Carrie's downfall. Remember how Miranda met that doctor? I know, I don't care either, but we have to talk about it anyway. Ted's off to a conference and tells Miranda to stay in his apartment as long as she wants. Of course, the second he's out the door, she rifles through every single thing he owns, looking for intel on the enemy. She finds exactly what she's looking for when she discovers a dirty, spanking-themed VHS in a drawer. Her reaction is where we see once again how somebody like Libby is demonised for not being a model and selling cheese. But hotshot lawyer Miranda? She's portrayed as being well within her rights to steal the tape, watch it with Carrie, and openly wonder whether this, of all things, is a reason why she can't see Ted ever again. Carrie resists the urge to ask why her friend is constantly on the lookout for a reason to kill and eat her dates, I'd guess because she's just glad to be having a conversation about Miranda's love life that doesn't involve Skipper's rancid mop top. Later, the friends gather in stupid party hats and sip champagne in the rain while they wait for Carrie's bus to come past. Mike appears and seems surprised that Libby recently dumped him in favour of somebody less afraid of intimacy, even though he asked her to be seen in public with him. He doesn't seem to realise how that sounds or what it says about him, but he's in exactly the right group for that not to be noticed or mentioned. Carrie's bus eventually rolls up, and she's horrified to see that somebody with an excellent sense of humour has scrawled a gigantic willy right next to her mouth. That evening, Miranda, previously disgusted by Ted's extremely private movie collection, decides to give being shallow a try when she's swayed by him buying her an expensive dinner. She leans into it so hard that she, in a roundabout way, offers to recreate his naughty tape with him for real. Here, a show with a supposedly open-minded and progressive view of sexuality manages to completely misinterpret the relationship, or lack thereof, between what somebody likes to watch and what they like to do. We're supposed to think that Ted realises that Miranda has seen the tape and is so embarrassed of his sex secret, see what they did there? Being out in the open, that he never sees her again. I think the more likely scenario is that he had a completely normal and understandable reaction to it being specifically Miranda that wants to haze him. Presumably terrified that some light spanking would be Miranda's gateway drug to full-blown murder, Ted goes into hiding. Later, a drunken Carrie stops by Big's apartment to end things with him due to his assumed shame over their relationship. He explains away the restaurant, awkward friend encounter, and no-show at the bus party with some fairly lame excuses which Carrie swallows immediately and without question. Not because they were especially convincing, but because Carrie didn't really go over there to dump him the way she claims. She went there looking for a fig leaf, no matter how tiny, to cover up her own embarrassment so that she could keep seeing Big. And once she gets it, it's straight off to bed as if none of it ever happened. Which is a shame, because if Carrie didn't have a binary emotional range, she could have avoided pretty much everything coming her way in their future shenanigans. But then, that wouldn't be any fun for the rest of us, would it? Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're suffering through Season 1, Episode 7 of Sex and the City. But before we get to that, last time I asked you how long you'd let things play out if you knew the person you were with was keeping you a secret. Enter commenter Run-Free Blackwolf, who proposed a three-way approach merging Libby, Charlotte, and Samantha, or as Carrie would call it, at least 20 columns and a book deal. Don't forget to wait until the bitter end of this video to get this week's question and subscribe to see whether your answer makes the cut next week. So today's installment is called The Monogamists, but don't let that worry you. It's far more to do with how you can weaponize monogamy and infidelity to get what you want from people. Fun! We begin with Carrie monologuing about how her fledgling relationship with Mr. Big has rendered everyone in the city except for them irrelevant. It's kind of her to invite Big into what we know by now to be a delusion she's had about herself for quite some time. During an apparently long overdue catch-up call with Miranda, Carrie crows about her new love but ominously notes that she doesn't want to compare it to past flings because they all ended. If she only knew at this point just how many ends she and Big were going to experience together, she'd probably invent the Peloton bike 2 decades early. And just like that, Carrie zeroes in on a problem to obsess over. She decides that she's forsaken her girlfriends for her boyfriend and sets out to make amends. At dinner, they fill her in on their latest happenings. Miranda handled a big merger at work apparently, but the writers certainly don't seem to care about it, and so neither do I. Samantha, it seems, has developed an obsession with finding a new apartment. And Charlotte is described as practically engaged to new beau Michael after a chance meeting in the park. I think this might be it, she slurs over a glass of Chardonnay, managing the impressive feat of out-Pollyannaing herself. However, Charlotte does admit that there's trouble in paradise, namely Michael's so far futile insistence on sailing his skin boat to Teeth Town. The act itself is apparently her only problem, rather than the close proximity of Michael's golden retriever, butterscotch, to the whole thing. How close does a dog have to be to an in-progress beach before it goes from a witness to a participant? Instead, Charlotte confesses that not only does she not enjoy the act of mouth-to-south resuscitation, but she's never actually done it. Setting aside Samantha's predictable horror, even Miranda and Carrie come off surprisingly supportive of the occasional hummer, but nevertheless support Charlotte's sloppy toppy strike. As they leave, Samantha spots Mr. Biggs sitting in the corner with a mystery lady. Loved up as she is, Carrie bypasses her usual instant paranoia in one of the rare scenarios in which it might have actually proved useful and goes over to say hello. She pulls the same trick she did in the last episode, Szechuan Place, and motions awkwardly with her eyes until she's introduced to Big's dinner companion. An unbothered Big informs Carrie that he's on a date, one of the apparently many he's continuing to enjoy while also with her. She keeps it together until the end of their conversation, but loudly vents her disbelief at Big's infidelity before she's even cleared the coat check. It's probably worth pointing out that nobody's truly in the right here. Big is obviously a player and does things that he knows aren't okay, but rationalises that they are because Carrie didn't explicitly forbid them. Carrie, on the other hand, deals with the problem as unhealthily as ever. She whips it up into both a column and a pair of sweeping generalisations. That men may be genetically incapable of monogamy, and in 90s New York, fidelity might be an expectation too far. Presumably Carrie's editor is a far kinder soul than I, because the idea that Big is in any way representative of all men is hilarious to the point of slander. Next, we join Samantha for a spot of real estate infidelity. After promising her first broker, Pamela, that she wouldn't, she property hops with English agent Rick. During the course of their handsy walkthrough, they give a whole new meaning to blowing out the back wall. For some reason, Carrie's torment over Big's multiple date disorder leads her to drinks with Stanford, who attends their cocktail summit dressed like a peach Melba somebody left out in the sun. He suggests that monogamy is over, and modern couples are keeping their options open. Presumably in Stanford's case, the options his love interests are keeping open are doors and windows so that they have ample choice of what to dive out of when he isn't looking. Stanford's acquaintance Jared then wanders over. Published author Jared is played by Justin Theroux, and when you've got that pictured in your mind, you'll understand why I say it's deeply unlikely that a man so attractive could have known Stanford long enough to become familiar without a restraining order having been filed. Carrie is flattered by Jared's flirting, an achievement in and of itself when he uses the words groovy and chow one after the other, and agrees to attend an upcoming party being thrown in his honour. We're supposed to think that Carrie is playing Big at his own game, but we know better. She's always got another angle. Later, Big briefly calls to confirm their date the following evening and makes the admirably ballsy move of pretending their restaurant encounter never actually happened. Despite her fury, Carrie betrays herself and all too eagerly accepts. Naturally, she immediately grabs dinner with Miranda to autopsy the 30-second conversation, asking whether it contains some kind of coded message of apology. Miranda doesn't have the time to get into it because the worst happens. Skipper passes by, and he's not alone. He stops to chat and introduces them to his girlfriend, Allison. It turns out Miranda dumped Skipper off screen sometime earlier, having spent all of their time together up to that point treating him like homework, by which I mean something she has to do but doesn't want to do. But that all flies out the window when she sees him with another woman, particularly when Vogue employee Allison makes it clear that she's committed high treason by being beautiful, confident, and successful. Given all of that, why she's with Skipper is anybody's guess. And I was wrong. That wasn't the worst that could happen. Because the writing team hates all of us, we're then forced to bear witness to a Skipper sex scene. It's horrific for all the reasons you'd expect, but the truly upsetting part is that Skipper's kissing technique closely resembles a Great Dane trying to lick wet kibble out from underneath a kitchen unit. Luckily, Miranda fires a completely inappropriate but still very much appreciated torpedo at the SS Skipper and Allison when she jealously calls to ask him out to dinner. Because Skipper's a lunatic, he answers the phone, accepts the invite, and breaks up with his girlfriend, all while the ship is still docked. If you know what I mean. Meanwhile, Carrie and Big attend a ridiculously overcrowded house party. In short order, Big is kissed by an ex-girlfriend, and the party's host mistakes Carrie for one of Big's other women. After claiming that she doesn't want anything from him anymore, an extremely transparent lie, Carrie leaves Big and heads for Jared's party instead. Elsewhere, Miranda lies next to Skipper in bed, probably wondering how he's going to skipper the situation. And she doesn't have long to wait. Miranda, you see, has mistakenly assumed that she could continue to use Skipper for an occasional no-pants dance and leave poor Allison to deal with him the rest of the time. In a rare and possibly one-off display of common sense, Skipper finally realises that she'll never want him long-term. Miranda makes the kind of weak attempt to make him stay, which baristas do when a customer walks in 10 seconds before closing time, but it's too late and Skipper walks out. At the same time, Charlotte is back at Michael's apartment, trying to avoid playing a tune on the pink oboe. She finally admits to him that she hates it and asks whether he really wants her to do something she doesn't want to, as Butterscotch pants 3 feet to her left. Michael's halo slips, and he implies that their recently agreed to exclusivity has a Lewinsky clause. Realising that he isn't interested in anything else she has to offer unless she agrees to perform a lip lock on his love muscle, Charlotte calls it a day. Side note, in case you think I'm too harsh on the writers of this show, just know that the dog was there for a reason. A scene was shot, but mercifully cut, where Charlotte discovers Michael slathering his between me down there in peanut butter so that Butterscotch could do what she wouldn't. There is no such thing as too harsh. While all this is going on, Samantha is still touring the city at midnight with Randy real estate representative Rick. He takes her to an apartment that just that second went on the market, then starts to take her in the same apartment. Just then, his rival Pamela walks in with a similarly house-hunting couple who are all treated to a top-front view of Samantha that you'd normally at least have to flirt with her a bit to get. At Jared's ego-stroking magazine party, Carrie is gamely entertaining his self-important waffle about his writing career. Over the top though he may be, he is at least direct and asks whether she'll go home with him. Before answering, Carrie steps away to call Big, and the game she's playing suddenly becomes clear. Carrie isn't interested in Jared. She only went to the party because she knew he wanted her and needed a vehicle to make Big jealous. She gets Big on the phone and tells him to meet her out front of the venue. When he shows up, she finally admits that what she wants from him is exclusivity. Of course, she does it in her usual flowery Carrie Bradshaw way, but at least she's being relatively clear about her feelings for a change. Notably, Big doesn't actually give her an answer. He responds to her metaphorical request to stand still with her in their relationship by literally doing just that, ending the episode staring up at the sky. Of course, if this was real life and an actual person with Big's personality was in that situation, he'd have been 3 blocks away by the time she finished spinning her latest romantic analogy. But we're expected to suspend our disbelief in service of these two being star-crossed lovers, something that would only actually be true if they were strapped to separate rockets and flown into each other in low orbit. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're having a menage a trois with Season 1, Episode 8 of Sex and the City, entitled Three's a Crowd. But before that, last time I asked you whether you found Miranda's jealous treatment of Skipper fine or problematic. Excellently named commenter Tallulah Lagash cut right to the heart of the issue by recommending that someone put Skipper on a register. Who knows, maybe his disappearance from the series with barely a mention is down to him legally having to stay 100 yards away from the other characters at all times. Carrie opens this episode with a fairy tale analogy. Once upon a time, she says, Charlotte fell in love. The once in that sentence is delivered without irony, but you and I both know that Charlotte falls in love as frequently as Todrick Hall's publicist has to delete his tweets. Miss York has been following a guy from party to party, which sounds less to me like Snow White and more like single white female. In any case, it works, and she bags herself a new man, Jack, who looks like just the kind of inbred neoconservative she'd love to take home for the holidays. After having an apparently amazing roll in the hay, Jack asks Charlotte what her fantasies are. Turns out she doesn't really have any, and worryingly the first place her mind goes in search of an answer is to do it in her parents' bed. For those counting, that's 2 episodes out of the last 3 where her daddy issues have threatened to burst out of her like a baby xenomorph. Jack's own fantasy though is locked and loaded, having another woman join them in bed. At lunch, she tells Carrie, Samantha and Miranda about Jack's indecent proposal. Miranda wearily proclaims that all men want the same thing, though does admit that she may have once done it herself after getting drunk in college and waking up in someone else's bra. Samantha doesn't have time to dwell on the possible crime her friend just detailed because this is her time to shine. Given how repressed Charlotte is most of the time, being able to encourage her to be even the tiniest bit adventurous must be like finding a rare gem. A boring one, but rare all the same. Delivering her sage wisdom like she's the Dalai Lama of doing it, Samantha explains that the other woman should be a stranger to avoid any drama. Charlotte makes it clear that she'd rather have a friend join her. Her first thought is Carrie, who is absolutely the last person you want anywhere near your love life unless your kink is chaos. Carrie in turn suggests Samantha. Nobody suggests Miranda because nothing ruins your buzz like seeing a friend twist off your boyfriend's head before you've even had a chance to dim the lights. Carrie decides to turn this into her next column, pondering whether threesomes are the new sexual frontier. She claims that men are obsessed with them, and the fact that things can come in threes is somehow proof of this. It's like watching the number 23, but somehow even more insane. While Carrie's making connections in threes, Samantha's across town concentrating on making just the one. She's been seeing married wine importer Ken, whose wife, Carrie snarkily tells us, designs modular office furniture. Apparently, being gainfully employed means you deserve to be cheated on. Later on, Charlotte dreams that she and Jack hit a bar and pick up a new friend for the bedroom. When she wakes up, we're told that this is the most excited she's been since high school. A damning indictment of her life so far, if ever I heard one. The next day, we find out that Miranda was more affected by being left off the list of Charlotte's potential additions than anybody realised. Dressed like an extra from Bugsy Malone, she moans to her therapist that their implied rejection has given her literal nightmares. There's no reason to expect this, but Miranda's moment of self-reflection fails to help her realise that if not being invited causes this much of a spiral, actually being invited would probably cause her to run through Times Square naked with a bunch of knives. At Big's apartment, Carrie makes the bold claim that they might be the only couple in Manhattan not advertising a part-time position in their relationship. This, it's worth remembering, is the same Big who Carrie had to force not to date other women at the same time as her in literally the last episode. As she helps Big choose a tie, Carrie wonders why it's almost sexier to put a tie on a man than to take it off him. My guess? It's her long-suppressed survival instincts kicking in and telling her to strangle him with it. When the talk turns to threesomes, she's horrified to hear Big say that he had one with an ex-wife she was previously unaware of. If Carrie can't deal with the idea that someone else touched her boyfriend before she met him, she's going to lose her mind when she finds out what happens at his proctology appointments. At a cosmetics store, Carrie tells her tale of woe to Samantha and Miranda. Inadvertently, Samantha confirms Carrie's worst fears by telling her that lover Ken's affair is down to his marital relations having become stale and boring. Carrie thinks this is what's happening to her and Big, for no good reason, it's worth pointing out, as they've gone from wild to sweet. Miranda, sensing another opportunity for an invite, tries on a new shade of lipstick and attempts to seduce Carrie. It's unsuccessful, but those of you who have watched And Just Like That know that while it takes her a couple of decades, she does eventually get her own back for this rejection in Carrie's kitchen. Her friends advise her that the best thing to do would be to check out Big's ex, in possibly the single worst piece of advice given in the entire series. Seizing permission to do something utterly crazy, Carrie turns up at the publisher ex-wife Barbara's office. Carrie is, of course, very upset to find that she isn't a haggard troll. The Bradshaw look proves about as potent as usual when her cover story, pitching a steamy romance novel, is blown apart by the revelation that Barbara is a children's publisher. As a journalist, you'd expect her brain to leap into action and whip up a brilliant new plot outline. Instead, career writer Carrie Bradshaw tries to sell a children's book about a little girl with magic cigarettes which transport her to New Jersey. Barbara mystifyingly loves the idea of an adult children's book. It's just as well Carrie couldn't pull something real together, because letting her tell stories to kids would be like letting John Wayne Gacy host an episode of Blue's Clues. Elsewhere, Samantha's trip to a flower shop is ruined by a chance encounter with Ken and his long-suffering wife Ruth. Ken manages to give the game away in under 20 seconds without actually saying a word. He practically drags away poor Ruth, who obviously knows exactly what her Zeta male husband has been up to. Miranda heads back to therapy, this time dressed like her next appointment is an audition for Newsies. With that fresh in your minds, it's perhaps unsurprising that her hypothetical proposition to be a third for her therapist goes unresponded to. As a slight aside, it's at times like these where what for a decent stretch of time was considered a pioneering show really lets its leading ladies down. There are airshow accidents with less intense spirals than these people nosedive into over the pettiest issues. You're left wondering whether what was pioneering about this show in the 90s was more that 4 women were talking explicitly about sex, and less what they were actually saying about it. After a night of imagining Barbara in bed with her and Big that to any level-headed person would be a wake-up call, Carrie instead joins her for lunch to discuss her fake book because she's a sociopath. Surprise, surprise, the publisher passed on Carrie's magical chain-smoking child. Another opportunity for an exit that she ignores because there's intel to be extracted. Over Chardonnay, she feigns ignorance of Barbara's history to discover that her marriage to Big failed because he slept with her best friend. You just know in that moment Samantha's face flashed across Carrie's mind. Speaking of, Samantha receives a call from Ken to tell her that he ended his marriage to be with her, and a simultaneous call from poor Ruth offering to join them in bed in order to save her marriage. Unwilling to play the Angelina to Ruth's Jennifer, she hangs up on them both in a demonstration of what normal people do when situations get too messy, which I wish Carrie had been there to see. That night, Charlotte and Jack attend a masquerade ball in what looks like a 2-bed apartment. They wind up in a spare bedroom and a woman they spotted earlier joins them. Because Charlotte isn't immediately made the filling in a Jack Stranger sandwich, and admittedly also gets kicked onto the floor, she storms out probably more certain than ever that sex should be done in the dark and only on the 29th of February. While Charlotte's getting kicked out of one stranger's bed, Miranda's self-confidence crisis has her trying to climb into another's. She answers an ad from a couple looking for a third and meets them at a bar. After confirming that at least one couple in Manhattan wants her, she dives out of the nearest fire exit and leaves them hanging. Classy move, Miranda. After 8 days, Carrie finally meets up with Big, who confronts her about being distant. In a voice that tells you that she considers herself the victim here, she explains that it was because he didn't give her an excruciatingly detailed account of his romantic history before daring to let her become obsessed with him. This time, however, Big came prepared. He's well aware that Carrie's been meeting up with Barbara and of what she's discovered about his cheating. Instead of being humbled, Carrie's instead annoyed that Big didn't tell her that he knew because nothing will ever please her when she's off the deep end. Don't get me wrong, Big's going to prove time and time again how terrible a boyfriend and person he is, but you've got to give him some credit for how calmly he handles this particular situation. He explains that opening up their love life was how he and Barbara worked towards realizing that they didn't want to be together anymore. The implication being that not asking for that with Carrie means that their love life isn't unsatisfying. Having received yet another nugget of validation, Carrie's rage is immediately diffused and she returns to factory settings like a malfunctioning Furby. Convenient? Yes, but the writers needed to wrap things up within the runtime, and so sometimes there just isn't time for a proper conclusion. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're racing to the finish line with Season 1, Episode 9 of Sex and the City, titled The Turtle and the Hare. Carrie begins this episode by telling us the tale of Brooke, who she claims is the most perfect person in a city of perfect people. And you know by now that when she's being needlessly complimentary about another woman, there's bound to be a sting in the tail. Brooke, an interior designer by trade, apparently only dates A-listers and has a new arm to hang off every weekend. We're shown the bland, besooted men in question, and frankly, the A in A-lister appears to stand for something uncomplimentary. Brooke finally decides to marry, and despite blowing a cool and wildly unnecessary $100,000 on the big day, courts disaster by inviting Carrie, Miranda, Charlotte and Samantha, as well as their shared plus one, dysfunction. Naturally, Carrie implies that Brooke's motivation in doing so was to show off, which is the only reason I can think of that all 4 of them decided to show up dressed for a funeral. At the apparently less prestigious of 2 singles tables, because of course she'd be offended by how much attention that would rob her of, they're joined by fellow guest Bernie Turtletaub. The Turtle, as he's known, is seemingly notable for his healthy investments and honking breath. He shows an immediate interest in Samantha and a surprising resilience in the face of how poorly all 4 of the ladies treat him. He engages Carrie in stinky, dull conversation while Charlotte avoids eye contact, Samantha dashes off to find better prey, and Miranda resists the urge to unhinge her jaw and chase the male guests around the dance floor like Ms. Pac-Man. On the way out, Brooke imparts each of them with little pearls of admittedly smug, newly married wisdom. Carrie's is the best. It's always better to marry someone who loves you more than you love them. If you have Carrie dashes back home to write a column about it on your bingo card, congratulations, you're a winner. People are always telling me things I don't want to hear, she says. We know this already, of course. They're things like stop writing about me, don't turn up at my house at 4 AM, and literally anybody else could do your job better. Carrie, who up until this point has shown nothing but disdain for any of the married couples she's encountered, calls Big to ask him about Brooke's comment and is horrified to hear him say that he has no intention of ever remarrying. Carrie wonders if she can date a man who wouldn't take her up the aisle unless he meant it as a euphemism for something she'd only allow on his birthday. At a lunch with her friends, which with hindsight she would have been better off scheduling with wedding-obsessed Charlotte alone, Carrie tries to explain why this is all such a big deal. Samantha essentially proposes tricking Big into wanting to get married by not mentioning it to him. Not her finest hour, but unsurprising when you consider that in her world, getting down on your knees and putting rings on fingers usually have very different meanings. Miranda, often found lurking in the middle ground of these debates when she isn't daydreaming about drinking the blood of nearby men, reveals an extremist stance for a change. Men are becoming obsolete. You'd hope that this would be the lead-in to a speech about empowerment, but it's actually because she's recently invested in a new bedroom appliance. And I don't mean a heated blanket. So enthusiastic is her sales pitch that she convinces Carrie and Charlotte to buy one too. Charlotte, who acts like she expected it to look and feel like a cactus, is won over by the fact that it's bright pink. Carrie doesn't have much time to form an opinion because once she's home, she's interrupted by a call from Samantha. Samantha is freshly back from a DOA date with Jerry, who she knows as a guest from Perfect Brooke's wedding, but who I know as that angel from Supernatural. Less angelic was Jerry's swift abandonment of Samantha for a younger woman almost immediately after arriving. Humiliated, she tried to leave, but bumped into bad breath Bernie. Ever direct, Samantha semi-tactfully pointed out his death breath and discovered two things: that it was the result of Chinese herbs, and that Bernie has an unexpected sense of humour. Coupled with a well-timed compliment that earns him enough brownie points to redeem for a position as Samantha's new fixer-upper. Carrie interprets this, in addition to Miranda's contentment with a battery-operated boyfriend, as a sign that others are just making do with whatever they can get. She meets up with Brooke as she understandably returns some minging wedding gifts and basically outright asks her if she got married to a mid-range guy just to get it out of the way. Under normal circumstances, by which I mean real life, asking this kind of question of a newlywed just back from honeymoon would get you a swift slap in the chops. But as usual, because this is Carrie's show, her wild and highly presumptuous theory turns out to be right. Brooke did settle, and when she spots Samantha playing dress-up with Bernie like he's a very off-brand Ken doll, she implies that the same thing is happening there. As though the universe sensed the need for a break, we then join Carrie and Charlotte at a nice, relaxing yoga class. Unfortunately, Charlotte takes the opportunity to talk about breaking her cloven tuft with her new pink plastic pocket rocket. That she does so in mostly conservative terms in a raspy whisper makes it sound like the Republican Party have started their own ASMR channel. Charlotte claims to be scared by the device's ability to reliably take her to O-Town and worried that its effectiveness means that she'll never want to go near a man again. Because very few people in this show are capable of a measured reaction to anything, Carrie notes the telltale signs that Charlotte is developing an addiction. After a night at the ballet with Stanford, Carrie points out a gay couple walking down the street like she just strolled past their enclosure at the zoo. Stanford claims to be over the gay scene, largely as a result of an unsuccessful personal ad he recently placed in which he chose to describe himself as an Ed Harris type, by which he just means balding. Stanford's solution to 15 years of similar rejections is to suggest that he and Carrie should enter a sham marriage, so that he can get his homophobic grandmother to cough up his inheritance. Of course, this doesn't actually fix the fact that New York's gay singles would rather go it alone than have him anywhere near them. But with a runtime of 23 minutes, the show doesn't have time to dwell on this completely nonsensical plot device while it grinds its marriage-shaped axe. After complaining last week that her sex life with Big had gone off the boil, Carrie spends an apparently passionate Sunday in his bed. When she tells Big about Stanford's proposal, he absolutely nails her to the wall when he sarcastically comments that it should make for an interesting column. After another cancellation, Carrie and Miranda crash Charlotte's rabbit party to stage an intervention. Charlotte reluctantly hands it over, and Miranda puts it, unwashed, straight into her handbag. I'm going to let you fill in the obvious joke about that one for yourselves. Samantha, meanwhile, is at dinner with her upgraded version of the middle-aged mutant boring turtle. She realises that for all her efforts to step up his appearance, he's still the same guy she couldn't stand to be around at Brooke's wedding. Knowing that she can't settle for an also-ran, she makes her excuses and leaves. Reluctantly at afternoon tea with Stanford and his grandmother, against the backdrop of a hideous Regency-style interior design nightmare, Carrie pretends to be a woman who hasn't clocked that her fiancé pitches, or let's be honest, catches, for a different team. After seeing all the photos of Stanford's family, Carrie realises that one day she'll want to start one of her own, and so the only beard her GBF is going to have access to anytime soon is the one growing on his grandma's chin. It turns out that it's all been for nothing anyway, because Don't Say Gay Granny is no slouch. She knows Stanford's real orientation and has no intention of ever letting him see a cent of her money, possibly because she's planning to spend it on more rancid 40-year-old Chanel outfits. At Big's place, Carrie watches him tip a load of salt into a tomato sauce without a word in what I'm choosing to believe is a sign that she's playing what will turn out to be a successful long game with his internal organs. She finally blurts out that she does want to get married someday and can't see the point in dating a man who doesn't. Big vaguely suggests that with time he might change his mind, and bizarrely, Carrie decides that she should slow down and live in the moment, which is exactly the opposite of the message she's been running towards this whole episode. Another example of how she actively allows her inexplicable fixation on Big to hold her in place when any other sensible person would already be kicking loose the release lever on the fire escape or setting fire to his parade of red flags to clear a path to the front door. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and first of all, a quick word of thanks. Since my last upload, you wonderful people have pushed the channel up over 500 subscribers. Thank you all for joining me on my snarky little journey through 90s New York, and I hope you all stick around as we watch Carrie find ever more creative ways to ruin her own life. And who knows, maybe we'll take a few detours along the way. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there's no time like the present. There's plenty more sarcasm where this came from. This week's episode is titled The Baby Shower, meaning that even being unborn isn't enough to spare you from Carrie Bradshaw's judgment. Carrie starts on a rare note of honesty as she admits that one of the hardest things in life is to be happy for somebody else. For you, Carrie. For you. After receiving invites to apparently close friend Lainey's baby shower, the bitter old lady brigade convene at Carrie's apartment to prove her right with their moaning. Mind you, they're not all on the same page this time. While Carrie, Samantha and Miranda would rather stick pins in their eyes than fawn over a baby bump, Charlotte's 2.4 children mania places her firmly in the opposite camp. Carrie theorises that this baby shower is particularly offensive because early 90s Lainey was a wild child. A thankfully brief flashback to a party shows Lainey turning the place into a bisexual love-in while Miranda, Samantha and Carrie look on. For some reason, everybody accidentally showed up dressed as different eras of Madonna. Carrie's premature music era cowgirl abomination looks like what would have happened if Lady Gaga planned her Joanne phase with a concussion. While Lainey's chosen era isn't immediately obvious, her dancing in the corner with her norks out at the slightest provocation implies it to be erotica. Carrie then attributes a long-time rivalry between Samantha and Lainey to the former's insecurity. A bit of projection from our plucky narrator, I think. Carrie goes on to moan that Lacey has gone off book, as she expected her to get it on with Sid Vicious. FYI, Sid Vicious died in 1979, so jumping his bones in the 90s would be both extremely literal and a sign that Lacey's problems run quite a bit deeper. Back in the present, Miranda claims that motherhood is a cult, and Carrie implies that they should attend Lainey's party because it'll be like a freak show. Again, this is somebody Carrie described 2 minutes earlier as a close friend. By the time the gang are all packed up and ready to head to Lainey's house in Connecticut, Carrie notes that her monthly visitor is a week late. Naturally, her reaction is to ignore it and begin dressing like the protagonist in a black and white French film about depression. As they pile into their rental car, we see two predictable extremes of gift giving. Charlotte rocks up with an overstuffed baby basket, and Carrie forgot, so decides that the basket is from her too. When they arrive at the shower, Samantha immediately dips out for a drink, and Charlotte is pulled beneath a scrum of like-minded boomers. Carrie and Miranda are introduced to the assembled mothers and their various quirks, one by one, like they're a crap version of the Avengers. Lainey saves the best for last, cheerily pointing out Betsy, who's described as being like an old married couple with her creepy-looking son Harry. I'll permit Carrie and Miranda their looks of terror here, not least because the way Harry is dressed makes it look like he has a 666 birthmark hidden underneath his bowl haircut. Having spent more than 30 seconds in a crowd who haven't made her the centre of attention, Carrie decides to do it for herself by wondering if the delayed appearance of her lady in red means that she'll soon join the cult of motherhood too. Of course, our handy knowledge of the future tells us that Carrie never does squirt out a twerp of her own, for which Generation Z should be eternally grateful. Not that it would matter anyway, because the pollution of the gene pool caused by any Bradshaw-Preston progeny would be an extinction-level event for humanity. Carrie escapes to the bathroom and discovers a nude portrait of Lainey hanging above the porcelain throne, which she takes as a sign that some of her old wild behaviour survived insemination. This is, of course, standard Carrie behaviour. Form an opinion, namely that mothers think they're superior to her but are really just as trashy as she is, then skulk around planting imaginary evidence until she's satisfied that she's right. She's like an extremely corrupt Columbo who looks only slightly better in a dress. In the den, Charlotte's praise of her host's perfect life ends abruptly when one of the mothers lets slip that Lainey has settled on the name Shayla if she has a girl. The name Charlotte apparently told everyone she'd picked out for her future daughter. Enter Samantha, who we're left to assume has been knocking back the contents of the drinks cupboard this whole time. After a decade of edging her hatred towards Lainey, she seizes on the justification to attack and with a well-slung insult, grabs the others and heads for the door. Having spent the afternoon judging mothers for what they see as their poor life choices, the gang stop off at a bar on the way home so that they can indulge in a spot of drink driving. Finally, Carrie's anxiety over her own potential impending motherhood catches up with her, and she admits that Aunt Flo has yet to arrive in town. Samantha compares the situation to being held at gunpoint, which isn't particularly helpful, but is at least very much on brand. Although unsure of what she'll do in a general sense, Carrie does decide not to tell Mr. Big. A wise move, since a relatively new girlfriend he seems only sort of into announcing her pregnancy is likely to send him racing for the nearest travel agent. Back at home, Charlotte pulls out a wish box which contains accumulated keepsakes of her dream life. A Shayla pillow is quickly thrown aside, and I don't have time to get into it, but she also tears up pictures of her dream homes and dream men. I don't recognise either of the gentlemen in question, but if you do, then feel free to comment below. Otherwise, I'm just going to assume that Charlotte goes around obsessing over stock images of anonymous men she finds in photo frames. Actually, you know what? Don't tell me. I prefer my way. Carrie and Miranda, meanwhile, go shopping for pregnancy tests. In a moment of crystalline clarity, Carrie admits that she doesn't think she'd be very good at motherhood because she used to mistreat her childhood dolls. Miranda tries to help by admitting to a spot of light animal abuse when she was a child, which, if you're unaware, is one of the telltale signs of a future serial killer, so again, very on brand. Regardless, the truth is that Carrie's mothering style would probably most closely resemble a cuckoo. Shoot your offspring out as efficiently as possible and then trick somebody else into raising it. Probably Charlotte, let's be honest. Carrie decides not to take the test, ignore her problems, and go to a party thrown by Samantha instead. When Lainey calls to blame her shady baby shower behaviour on hormones, Carrie makes the grave error of telling her where she's off to. At the party, Carrie muses that Samantha only threw it because of what she refers to as her inadequacy. I truly don't know what she has against Samantha this week, but since Ms. Jones doesn't want kids, loves life and does whatever she wants, I'll just have to chalk it up to Carrie deflecting her own issues and frankly being an a-hole. Carrie's inability to keep her mouth shut about anything ever leads to Lainey bursting through the door like the Kool-Aid Man. She waddles in like a demented penguin, intent on having the kind of fun her suburban life has robbed her of. Because of course, Carrie's insane theory about motherhood being a mask has to be right. Shallow Charlotte's shattered dreams are stuck back together by fellow partygoer, stock trader and Hampton's homeowner Jonathan. Because apparently men's only career choices in Sex and the City's New York are writer, financier or unemployed. Tired of being diverted from the bar by Killjoy Carrie, who is for once using her powers for good, Lainey remembers that two guests have been missing from the party this whole time. Her honkers. She gives her usual stripping routine the old college try, but only gets as far as flashing her shoulder, like she's starring in an edit of Showgirls that has to be shown mid-afternoon at a church event. As Carrie bundles her into a taxi back to Connecticut, Lainey ominously tells her that one day she'll wake up and not recognise herself. Accurate. As if self-administering exposure therapy in the creepiest way possible, Carrie spends the whole next day sitting on a bench watching children in a play park and somehow not getting arrested. On the way home, her body, having had enough of this storyline and keen to stop her from landing it in jail for the rest of its life, cordially invites her to the Red Wedding, and so puts an end to her indecision. We're left to wonder whether Carrie had decided that she did want to become a parent after all. If it helps with this downbeat ending, I'll remind you that any kid of Carrie's would likely end up singing for pennies at the Port Authority long before she prioritised them over a footwear sale. Silver linings and all that. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're crossing the barren desert that is Season 1, Episode 11 of Sex and the City, entitled The Drought. But before we do that, last time I asked you whether you'd go full Charlotte on your friend if they gave their spawn the baby name you'd been saving for your own crotch fruit. And this week we've got a twofer. Commenter Bianca wouldn't, calling out Ms. York for not realising that the two Shaylas would probably never meet. And commenter Gray said they might, but only if the other mother in question was mean about it. Now all that's left is for the two of you to steal each other's baby names and see what happens. Keep us updated. New York City is all about sex, says Carrie to open the episode, scoring a 10 for judgment but a solid 0 for self-awareness considering that talking about it is her whole career. She says that when you do get someone in bed, that's where the real fun begins. The irony of this line being accompanied by a scene of her in bed with Mr. Big is predictably lost on her. As they messily share a nutty yogurt in what I presume was supposed to be a sexy scene, I messily share the lunch I ate 3 hours ago with the floor. Carrie says she and Big growing more comfortable sleeping next to each other is the way she always dreamed it could be. Sadly, that little dream comes tooting to an end when she wakes up one morning and lets out a tremendous buttock bassoon right next to Big. Rather than deal with this as the perfectly normal bodily function it is, Carrie Dutch ovens herself and runs face first into the bedroom door in a desperate attempt to hide her shame. Dashing out of the apartment like she'd stolen the silverware, she spends the whole day reliving the apparent trauma of her accidental arsebark with an intensity that suggests that she also followed through. After forcing herself to laugh it off with Big over takeout the next night, they head to bed. And that's where the problems really begin, because Big rebuffs Carrie's advances in favour of an early night, which she attributes to her backdoor breeze. As expected, Carrie careens into a freakout about what it all means and meets up with Miranda at a nail salon to publicly discuss her latest conflama. By this point, Big has stonewalled Carrie's attempts at seduction twice more, which Miranda counters with an admission that she hasn't had any bam bam in the ham ham for a full 3 months. In a sign of the times, Miranda says she's spent all of her spare time renting videos at Blockbuster instead. I really hope you all remember what Blockbuster was, because if not, I'm going to retire to a cave and continue to waste away into an aged husk. Miranda is refreshingly unbothered when Carrie admits that she crimped off some breakfast biscuits in Big's bed. She's rightfully more concerned by Carrie's ridiculous claims that her rectal dragon shout has rendered her forever unworthy of him. Carrie asks deadpan serious whether it's normal to be in bed next to your boyfriend and not do anything. Given that she strikes me as the type to want an immediate post-coitus appraisal like a Happy Valley is getting a performance review, I can understand Big's need for a break. Having been met with far too much logic and reason so far, Carrie seeks out Samantha for an alternate take. At a yoga class, Samantha delivers the goods. She tells Carrie that her dry spell is a barometer of her relationship's health and that cutting the cheese in front of Big was a huge, smelly no-no. In any event, Samantha is otherwise occupied trying to get their yoga instructor, Siddhartha, to take care of her downward-facing dog split. After the class, she learns that he practices tantric celibacy. Following her initial disbelief that anybody could turn down a good bone storming, she starts to consider whether there might be something to his hands-off approach. For reasons better kept to herself, Carrie decides to go 3 for 3 in advice about her own involuntary celibacy by going to dinner with Charlotte. As expected, Pollyanna York doesn't see any issue with it and shares that she and her new boyfriend Kevin have been going out for weeks and barely made it past first base. Charlotte smugly says that she loves how he respects her boundaries. When Kevin shows up for the meal too, he wipes the grin right off her face by revealing that years ago, at least part of him made it past Carrie's boundaries. After a quick grilling, although not the kind Carrie would like, it's established that she ended things between them because Kevin was a sex maniac. Charlotte assumes that his newfound restraint must therefore all be for her. As a result, she decides to have Carrie's sloppy seconds for dessert. Except Kevin's not into it because since going on Prozac, his libido is non-existent. That he goes on to describe his baloney pony as looking like taffy on occasion is a bit too much even for me. Across town, Samantha is receiving some tantric tutelage from her new instructor. Siddhartha, by the way, is the original name of the Buddha, so props to the writers for picking up one book about Buddhism and co-opting literally the first name they saw. Samantha is understandably distracted from the lesson by her teacher's bony cannelloni standing at full mast. Despite offering him a complimentary spit and shine, she finds herself rebuffed again. Inspired by her neighbours across the street making the beast with two backs in front of an open window, Carrie rocks up at Big's apartment. Once there, she does her best impression of sexy, which turns out to be just wearing a skirt and writhing all over him like a snake dying on a hot sidewalk. When he tells her to stop, she storms out and waits what she describes as an obligatory 10 seconds in the hallway to see if he'll come after her. Wisely, he doesn't. Once home, she immediately checks her voicemail, certain that he'll have left a grovelling message of apology. Even more wisely, he hasn't. 2 days later, Carrie reassures herself that she isn't having an insane overreaction by repainting her whole kitchen as a distraction. Miranda comes over to provide some moral support, but just as they're making some headway into how Carrie pretends to be an idealised version of herself around Big, they spot the neighbours crashing the custard truck in full view of the street again. In a delightfully inappropriate and lightly criminal scene, the rest of the group come over and all four of them eat snacks and watch the unsuspecting couple go at it. This spot of voyeurism inspires Charlotte to try again with Kevin and Miranda to say that if her sexual starvation stretches to 4 months, she'll hump one of them. All I'm saying is the signs were there, alright? On her way to take out her frustrations on the gummy bear population of the local blockbuster, Miranda encounters a builder who had catcalled her earlier. While she ignored him before, this time she offers to take him up on his proposition, only for him to sheepishly admit to having a wife. Miranda thinks this is down to him being all talk, but maybe he just recognised her from a police sketch he'd seen of a woman linked to hundreds of men's disappearances and understandably feared for his life. Samantha, while commendably having tried something outside her comfort zone, loses patience with Siddhartha's abstinence. She successfully propositions a guide her next yoga class and disappears off to combine the tree pose with the triangle. Meanwhile, Professor Charlotte has decided that she can defy medical science and get Kevin's motor running. Unfortunately, the motions she makes in doing so look like she's trying to get a fire going with 2 pebbles and a floppy twig. If you ever think Charlotte might be the least problematic of our Fab Four, then what she does next really puts her back in the running. After giving up her chafy rub and tug, she asks Kevin whether he'd ever stop taking his medication for her. Quick note, if anyone ever asks you a question like this, make sure you blow out their eardrums with a sonic boom in your wake as you take your immediate leave. Despite praising Kevin's lack of interest in her body when she thought it was out of respect, discovering that it's a medical issue leads her to end things. 1 part healthy choice, 1 part crass selfishness. Which could be the tagline for the whole show, come to think of it. Back at Carrie's DIY kitchen balls up, which she describes as fabulous but looks to me like she taped a paintbrush to a stray cat and forced it to freebase catnip, Big finally shows up. She admits that she was having a meltdown when they last saw each other, a piece of honesty about as rare as rocking horse turds. After becoming another witness to Carrie's neighbour's floor show, Big finally takes her to bed to end their drought. The show wants us to think that Big coming over to Carrie's apartment, liking it, and being okay with her more chaotic side is him coming to terms with who he now knows her to be, and her becoming more comfortable being her real self around him. Except, this is the same Carrie who has, in a matter of months, stalked his ex-wife for intel, manipulated him into monogamy by threatening to get with someone else, and at least considered marrying her gay best friend because Big didn't want to take the plunge again. Carrie being a bit of a mess is hardly news to him. So all we're left with is that this whole thing has been one intense self-inflicted tailspin over what turned out to be a perfectly normal situation in the bedroom. After all, if being rejected 3 times is grounds for a breakdown, then every dating show would have a conveyor belt leading directly to the nearest psych ward. Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and the moment has finally come. The final episode of Sex and the City Season 1, entitled O Come All Ye Faithful. That's the one full of church stalking, nun-based PTSD, and teeny tiny todgers. But before that, last episode I asked you whether Carrie's concern over her trouser trumpet was understandable. Commenter Fiery Eurochick reluctantly said yes, based on Carrie's admission that she goes so far as to pose around Big. Unless, of course, those poses were just a way of contorting herself to avoid any more escapees from her prison purse. And if you're new around these parts, why not check out the playlist for the full first season using the link on screen now. We open on Miranda, who has been dating Thomas, an up-and-coming playwright and up and out of bed for a shower immediately afterwards sex partner. Miranda is visibly mortified to learn that Thomas's strict Catholic education by nuns led him to develop the habit of rinsing off his sin after acts of the flesh. I'd say she should have seen it coming, considering his childhood clearly left him with a thing for volatile, authoritarian women. Miranda tells Carrie that Catholic men should wear a sign to warn potential dates, which is rich coming from somebody who's only ever one crossed word away from eviscerating every man within arm's reach. Suddenly curious about who the city's worshippers are, Carrie hangs out opposite a Presbyterian church and judges their fashion choices like the creep she is. And because we've got an A-plot to shuffle down the road here, it just so happens that this church is attended by none other than Mr. Big. I'll leave it up to you whether you truly believe that Carrie just so happened to pick this of all the available churches in the city. She's a textbook, unreliable narrator, so it wouldn't be a shock to find that she's lying to the audience in voiceover now too. Big spots Carrie and slithers over to reveal that while he's an atheist, he still takes his mother to church every Sunday. Carrie labels this an awkward relationship moment, one where you find out new things about someone you thought you had all figured out. If she entertained for even a single second the delusion that she knew everything about Big, then what's to come is richly deserved. Over cocktails, Miranda gloomily notes that Big accompanying his mother into a place of worship must be a bad omen. Charlotte reliably ignores the religious aspect entirely and says that a man who cares for his mother is good marriage material. Presumably she hasn't gotten around to watching Psycho yet. Samantha eventually shows up and announces that she's in love with new beau James. Charlotte is so delighted that it looks like her jaw is about to pop off, climb up Samantha's legs, and go full Fresh Prince on her. Samantha met James at a jazz club, where he sauntered over to her table wearing a white jacket that makes him look like a bankrupt casino owner. He later feeds her half a Krispy Kreme donut, and as far as we're shown, that's apparently enough for Samantha to think relationships aren't a complete waste of time. She's so into James that she's even waiting before taking him to bed. Charlotte's happiness for her friend is short-lived, however. She realises that this means that Samantha might actually get married before she does, and going off the look on her face, she'd rather someone had ran through the doors at full speed and drop-kicked her in the clam pot. In response, Charlotte goes off the deep end and books a reading with Psychic to the Stars Noni. Charlotte has a very specific question to ask of the world beyond the veil. When will she get married? If I were getting bothered in the afterlife by this kind of trivial rubbish, I'd be inclined to mess with her regardless of what the truth is. It looks like the spirits chose instead to mess with the crew of the show itself, as a boom mic floats in and out of shot above Noni's head throughout the whole reading. As it stands, the cards laid out before Charlotte inform her that she won't be walking down the aisle. While Noni obviously thought she had a normal client on her hands, Charlotte's immediate nervous breakdown at the thought of never becoming a Mrs. corrects that misassumption in record time. Elsewhere, Carrie waits until Big's just about to eat his first mouthful of dinner before she outright asks when she's going to be taken to church to meet Mother Preston. He successfully deflects her inquiries by offering a trip to the Caribbean, though it's obvious that his reluctance to have his mother meet the woman he's dating is going to be a problem that Carrie's magpie materialism won't mask forever. Miranda decides that rather than talk through Thomas's belief that cleanliness is next to godliness and not next to his sweaty naked body, she'll try forcing him to stay in bed after they're done. When he makes a break for the shower anyway, she patronisingly explains that there's nothing sinful about what they've done together.
Shame!
Thomas sarcastically berates Miranda for having saved his soul, kicks her out, and puts a big Catholic curse on her by saying she's free to work with the lepers now. Downtown, Samantha has decided that it's time for she and James to take the next step in their relationship. For her, this would normally mean bulk buying coconut oil and renting professional recording equipment, but this time it's just making a regular vanilla sheet monster. After they declare their love, she's devastated to learn that he's packing more of a chipolata than a bratwurst. The following Sunday, Carrie and Miranda turn up to Big's church unannounced so that they can spy on his mother-son outing. On cue, Carrie knocks her prayer book off the balcony and attracts the attention of the whole parish, Big included. Rather than leave like she planned to, and arguably should have, to await any later recriminations, she chooses to lurk by the door after Mass for the reigning Motherboy champions to show up. When she finally gets the introduction she's been craving, Big deals her the double blow of referring to her as his friend and clearly not even having mentioned her to his mother in the first place. While this cringeworthy situation is, as usual, mostly her own doing, I will admit that the little carry she tries as Big's mother walks away is genuinely heartbreaking. Then we're straight back into nobody's in the right territory. Carrie turned up to spy on Big and forced a family meeting he clearly wasn't comfortable with, and he compounds his awkward friend zoning by saying that his mother doesn't need to meet another girlfriend and would only do so when he's sure about her. Since I refuse to believe that anybody really acts this way, what's left is that the writers needed Big to really go nuclear with how badly he screws this up. Mostly in service of making Carrie's holy espionage look, if not justified, then at least worthwhile because it finally properly exposes quite how much of a D-bag he is. In an effort to forget their troubles, Carrie and the ladies accept an invite from Stanford to an evening of fragrant sacrilege by attending a perfume launch in a repurposed church. Stanford introduces his new boyfriend Elan, the designer of the perfume's bottle, which looks like a glassblower sneezed halfway through the job and so isn't something that I'd be showing off about. Carrie muses that the couple both value style above all else, which somebody ought to remind Stanford's putrid colour palette and Elan's sailor suit about. It turns out that Scrubadub Thomas should have been the psychic instead of Noni, because after telling Miranda she could go work with the lepers, she runs into their social equivalent when Skipper sidles up to the bar. Forgetting her many previous rejections, he suddenly finds himself in the sweet spot between nothing and a man who needs to cleanse himself after touching you. Carrie, Charlotte and Miranda find Samantha in the bathroom mournfully staring at her stubby lipstick. She bursts into tears and admits that James's Johnson just isn't cutting the mustard, a phrase which I've just now realised is disgusting in this context. Charlotte's attempt to look on the bright side by asking if he's at least a good kisser leads Samantha to compare his package to a gherkin, which I hope is purely based on size and not colour, texture or smell. Back at the bar, Miranda invites Skipper to come home with her. His pathetic disbelief that she'd let him stay a whole night would be a warning klaxon in the ears of any other man, but not Prince Fedora, so off they go. Samantha, bless her, heads back home to make a go of it with James. He goes what he thinks is to town on her, but by her standards is actually more like a trip to the mailbox. The next day, Carrie paces the apartment waiting for Big to show up and take her on vacation. But she isn't willing to go unless he tells her there's a future for their relationship, which doesn't involve her being shuttled between locations under a blanket like a prisoner on trial. But Big can't do it. Carrie thinks it's because he's unwilling to let his guard down. But honestly, it's more likely to be equal parts his slimy playboy eccentricities and her inability to paint a picture of their life together, which doesn't involve her planting trackers on everything he owns like a rogue CIA operative. I'd like to tell you that this is just down to their particularly toxic dynamic, but Carrie's about to embark on another 6 full seasons and 2 movies, which, to put it mildly, suggests that she's the common denominator in most of her romantic disasters. No matter where it comes from, Carrie makes one of her healthiest decisions ever by telling Big that while she loves him, it's over. It's unfortunate that this resolution won't last, but at least in this moment, she isn't actively seeking out a romance, which is the emotional equivalent of throwing herself under the wheels of his town car. As Big drives away, Carrie tells us that while she couldn't find faith in him, she did find it in herself, and her ability to one day find a man who knows that she's the one. And of course, we know this all comes true. His name is Aidan Shaw, and she'll reward his long sought after certainty by chewing his life up like an anxious Rottweiler. But that's a story for another time.